Good morning. Let's do that again. Good morning. That's better. Now we're ready to go. My name is Spencer Burke, and I'm proud to say I'm the adjunct lecturer in family business at the Olin School, and it is really just a privilege to be with you all this morning, and I hope you enjoy the program as much as I think I'm going to enjoy the program. In my day job, I'm a principal at the St. Louis Trust Company. We're a multi-family office here in Clayton and active with families all over the country, many of whom own substantial family businesses. My job here is twofold, is to welcome you to the symposium. This is our third annual Olin Symposium, and this event is being live streamed, so we welcome our online audience, and we also welcome tweeters using the hashtag /OlinNow when tweeting. So my job will be to keep us on time, which will be a Herculean task, and my other job is to introduce the spectacular Chancellor of Washington University, Mark Wrighton.
Thanks very much, Spencer, and welcome to all who are here and those following us online. It's a great pleasure to be involved here with this third annual Family Business Symposium of the John M. Olin School of Business. Thank you all for participating. This is an incredibly important initiative being led by the Dean Mark Taylor, from whom you'll hear in just a moment. But there's some special people here this morning, and I have a special announcement that I'd like to make. I would like to invite Roger, Fran, Paul, Elke, and Dean Taylor, the Koch family, please come forward. Together with Mark Taylor, please come forward. We're really grateful for the leadership, vision, and transformative gifts that are being provided by Roger, Fran, Paul, and Elke Koch in the very near future. Mark Taylor and his team here at the John M. Olin School of Business will commence their search for a faculty member to serve as the inaugural holder of the newly created Koch Distinguished Professorship in Family Business. This faculty member will also be privileged to lead the new Koch Center for Family Business here at our School of Business. These gifts, along with a new distinguished professorship in our School of Law, will create a total of $12 million of new endowment. In addition to this very generous commitment of endowment, the Kochs will be providing additional expendable gifts which will help with the ongoing growth and development of the Family Business Center named in their honor. I'm delighted to stand with you today to celebrate the launch of this new strategic initiative in family business education, research, and outreach here at our John M. Olin School of Business. The Kochs have been passionate about seeing a greater focus on family business here at Olin for many years, and they have patiently worked with us, beginning first with Dean Mahendra Gupta, and now with the leadership of Mark Taylor. We are really moving forward. Each of these individuals is associated with the university, of course. There are a large number of advanced and undergraduate degrees from Washington University in the hands of these outstanding people. They have been extremely successful, and I'm very pleased, of course, that they are sharing their success with Washington University and therefore sharing their success with others. Future generations will benefit enormously from the commitment that you have made to establish the Koch Center for Family Business. So thank you very much, and I'd like to call forward Dean Mark Taylor for his remarks. Join me, please, in thanking the Koch family.
Thank you, Chancellor. And thank you, Roger, Fran, Paul, and Elke. We're truly grateful for your dedication and support of Olin. And we have, I think, some little gifts here to mark that the moment, which are some inscribed clocks.
Oh, wow.
Appropriate.
Does it have a name? Oh, I know. Wonderful. From the clockmaker, right?
So it's no secret that I'm a horologist, and this couldn't be a better, more timely gift to give to our wonderful guest.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it was really clear from the moment I arrived in St. Louis that the family business is integral to this community. And in fact, among the very first people I met at the very first occasion that I spoke, even before I became dean, I did meet Roger and Fran and Paul and Elke. And over the last year or so, we've become very good friends, as well as have established our thoughts together about how we can push forward family business. And we have, the Koch family have introduced me to wonderful restaurants in St. Louis and in Naples, in Florida. And I've introduced them to English scones and tea. And my clock collection. Family business is obviously extremely important to this city, to this region, and to the national economy. It accounts for something like 64% of US GDP, over 60% of employment. Nearly 80% of new job creation is in family businesses. And when you look at those figures worldwide, that trend is even larger. So studying family business is extremely important. And the Kochs have been extremely instrumental in thinking about how we push that forward. Building on the energy of the last Family Business Symposium last year, we have been in discussions about how we can develop a family business center that in some ways is unique, in the sense that it will have a very, very strong practical application, and will be strongly involved with family business, and will also have a very, very strong research side. And Paul and Elke and Roger and Fran were very, very keen and very, very firm in our discussions that we should have this very, very, very strong research leader that would lead the Family Business Center, as well as having a very, very practical side. The Kochs have not been alone in their support of this program. A group of devoted and thoughtful Olin MBA students, several of whom are here today, led by John Stupp III, Ryan Mayer, Ryan Plotkin, and Chris Hoffman, with guidance from my predecessor, Dean Mahendra Gupta, formed the Family Business Club, which quickly became one of the most active student clubs at Olin. And I would like to recognize these individuals for their efforts, which, coupled with the vision and contributions of the Koch family, bring us to where we are today. Perhaps we could applaud that effort. Thank you. I would also, of course, be remiss if I didn't mention the tremendous role our friend Spencer Burke has played in raising awareness and support for this program as well. Spencer not only brings this symposium to life each year, he also teaches Olin's popular Topics in Family Business course. And all of you who know Spencer know that he is very passionate about family business, and he's provided me and my Vice Dean, Todd Milbourne, with tremendous insights on this topic and its impact on the global economy. Thank you, Spencer, for all that you do for Olin. We look forward to our continued work together. Well, I'm delighted to see such an impressive gathering of family business leaders, distinguished alumni, and university trustees. I also want to welcome a very special group of attendees, our students. They're the next generation of world-changing business leaders, and we can be heartened about the future because of their promise. The Koch Center for Family Business is supported by the Office of Corporate Relations, where corporations, businesses, students engage to create the Olin experience. And if you're interested in further engagement with the Family Business Program, please contact our program manager, Laura Benoit, or Dorothy Kittner, who are Head of Corporate Relations, to explore those opportunities. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Marcel Smits, Executive Vice President, CFO, and Chief Compliance Officer of Cargill Incorporated. For over 150 years and 7 generations, Cargill and its family owners have developed and nurtured the right combination of leadership to be successful and continue their strong global footprint. Marcel came to Cargill from Sara Lee, where he was CEO as well as Chief Finance Officer. Additionally, he teaches corporate governance and other topics at universities around the world and is a recognized international authority in this field. I'm pleased to welcome Marcel Smits and Spencer Burke to the stage for a moderated discussion.
Welcome. Thank you, Dean Taylor. Marcel, it's great to have you here.
Pleased to be here. Pleased to be here.
A
Thank you
mere
all for tuning in.
$110 billion of revenues. Could you give us an overview of Cargill and what goes on there? And
Yeah,
the
we
activities you're
can
in?
do that. So we have a couple of slides,
Okay.
which I think we should probably turn on. Overview of Cargill, and a lot of people ask us, what is it that we do? What kind of business are you? We have been in business now for 153 years. We're a private company. We're a very large company. I don't necessarily keep track of where we are in the league table. I don't think that's all that relevant. We're a very global operation. We operate in something like 70 countries, 150,000 people, and on every given day, we normally have another 100,000 people in our operations from third parties helping us. So that's a brief summary. We are a company with a purpose, so we're very focused on doing the right thing, and our purpose statement talks about providing the world with food, being a leader in nourishing in a safe and sustainable way. Behind those words, safe and sustainable, there's a whole world of meaning and programs. We can talk about that later. So we're very focused around food supply chains and increasingly other dimensions of safety coming from agricultural communities, or of sustainability coming from agricultural communities. And this is what we do. So this slide, people ask, what is it that you do? And I normally start with saying, well, it started with a grain elevator. So a grain elevator is a point where farmers deliver their grains. Somebody who runs a grain elevator buys the grains from the farmer, and then normally sells those grains forward on the stock exchange in order to make sure that you don't have a price risk until the day that you decide that you don't sell forward because you think that prices are going to go up. Once you do that, you're in the trading business. So that's how you get from a storage business into the trading business. You then look around and you say, hey, we got all these rail cars coming in and out. Why don't we own a bunch of rail cars? Oh, and by the way, why don't we just own a port that is on the other side, and why don't we own some of the boats that actually take the grains to the other side of the world? And now you're the owner of a logistical setup that moves grains from countries of surplus to countries of deficit, or regions of surplus to regions of deficit. A lot of those grains get to be processed into food ingredients, and we are in the food ingredient business. So from the grain business, you can get into the food ingredient business. We make high fructose corn syrup that goes into soft drinks, for example. On any given day, you probably eat, Americans on any given day will eat 30 times an ingredient that comes from a Cargill company. So we're in oils, we're in sweeteners, we're in cocoa and chocolate, range of food ingredients. While you're at it, a big chunk of the products that we make, that we sell, the grains, go to animal feeding, very big component. So we have an animal feed business, which is the world leader. And while you're at that, you might as well get yourself into the business of raising animals and harvesting them. So we are in the protein business. So that's a bit the story of Cargill. And actually, that's pretty close to the way it's gone. I think we got ourselves into the protein business because one of our feedlot customers went upside down, and we said, okay, we'll take the business. So that's how we got into the protein business. And then lastly, on top of that, we have 3 financial businesses. So we have a loan origination business, a risk management business, and an asset management business. It's a fairly diverse portfolio, and I think the best way to describe Cargill is to say we are private, we are diversified, and we owe it to our shareholders to be diversified because they have all their money in one basket, so we provide risk diversification on their behalf, and we are an integrated operating company, so we collaborate across all the businesses that I've just described.
And with many strategic alliances and partnerships. I think you have a slide.
Yeah, we
on
have
that.
one more slide on that. So that's the, oh, sorry. These are, if that works, that doesn't work. Maybe somebody else can forward the slide for me. Ah, here we go. So we have somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 customers. We reckon we're starting to find that out because we're becoming a more integrated business, so we're starting to get more visibility on what goes on all across Cargill. But here are a couple of the very well recognized names. So we are one of the largest suppliers of McDonald's. We provide them their patties, we provide them their oil, we provide them their eggs. We collaborate with them on a range of subjects around sustainability, changing some of their food supply chains, food safety. So that's a very important customer. We're a very important supplier to Unilever. Again, sustainability issues, and that's our point of differentiation. So these are some of the customers that we have, and it goes, down to businesses around the globe.
Marcel, everybody's wondering, with your background, which is in the program, what is it about your background that prepared you to be really one of the top executives at the largest family-owned business in the world, or at least one of them? What is it about your background?
Yeah, so I thought about that a little bit, because I'll tell you one thing in a minute. So I've said to my colleagues, look, I think that my successor should be an internal candidate because I think it's a high-risk proposition to bring somebody from the outside. And they said, what are you talking about? It was fine. And given the business description that I've just given you, I think it's pretty risky to try and find somebody who plays across all of those different industries. And I've had a significant learning curve. So it took me a while to figure out, okay, what is it that Cargill does, or does Cargill do in all of these different businesses? Going back to your question, what prepared me, thought about that a little bit. I think that one thing that has helped me a lot is I was the CFO of a retail business, traditional retail business, and my boss, the CEO, explained to me one day, and this must have been in early 2000, that Amazon wasn't a real business. And then 5 years later, I was the CFO of a telecommunications company, and then my boss proceeded, a new boss, of course, proceeded to explain to me that he felt that Google was a little odd, and why on earth would you buy YouTube for $2 billion? And that was really not a good business either. So from that, I think I've learned that the status quo is just another option. I have an acute awareness of the fact that business can get disrupted because I've lived through it twice. So that's one. And then the other thing in my resume, I've for a big part of my career, most of my career, I've always been in situations where something really needed to get done. I was the CFO for Unilever of our Colombian and Venezuelan business when Venezuela went through a very big monetary crisis. They do that every 10 years or so. So they know how it plays out. And then I've been in China for Unilever in a very complicated business that needed a lot of work. And from that, I think I've learned that you better get on with things.
That's great.
And then lastly, I was going to say this. So this is personal. My father died when I was 9. But he is a towering figure in terms of the values that he projected on his family. So that helps a lot. So I come from a background where my father was self-made. So, values of humility, and I live with a credo that success is good for ego, bad for character. And I've had, I've had peaks and peaks and troughs in my career, and I very firmly believe that if you're on a peak, you just stay with your feet on the ground because you're going to go off on the other side of the hill, and so just don't get ahead of yourself.
Gotcha. That's great advice. Talk about longevity. I think many family businesses in the audience in the say second, third, you're in the 7th generation. What would you attribute the longevity too at Cargill? What?
Yeah, we celebrated our 150th anniversary 3 years ago. So, we've had a fair amount of time to think about that subject. And Cargill, through its history, has been in and out of all sorts of businesses. So we've been in steel, we've been in energy, you get out of it, you get in it, and it changes over time. And I think the constant factor is the values. So I think the founders of the company started talking about good values. Our word is our bond. That's something that people talked about, as far back as 150 years ago. And it was a very important business enabler in the industry that they were in. But that notion of we do good things, we stick to our commitments, I think that's been the constant theme throughout all of the 150 years. And you can make variations on your business strategies and on your geographies, what you're in and what you're out, and that's all fine. But the one thing that I think has been constant over the years has been this commitment to good ethics. Doing good business, doing good things, treating people respectfully. And over the years, of course, doing good things gets a different meaning. It has a different meaning in 2018 than it had 150 years ago, but that notion of we as a company are committed to having a positive impact on the communities in which we operate, I think is an enduring theme, and that has held everything together. Because if you have that as as your North Star, then a lot of the things that in the moment can feel very, very important actually become a little
Interesting.
small.
Marcel, talk about the challenge of succession. In the history of Cargill, there was a defining moment, if you will, in the 60s when everybody turned around and the larder was bare in terms of who's next in this company. And I don't know whether you're in that situation today, but maybe talk about the lessons learned from the 60s that inform you about your future. Yeah,
that's a very interesting story. So in 1961, in the summer of 1961, it's actually just in the summer before I was born, I realized the other day, there were a number of unfortunate events in the family. So some of the people who had been traditionally managing the company passed away. One of them had a stroke. And there was immediately, there was a succession issue. There was a gap in management. And there were 5 family members who were the young and rising generation, but none of them was older than 37, so they're all in their early 30s. And they had a long set of conversations and deliberations, and they came to the conclusion that they themselves had not yet acquired the acumen or the experience that you needed in order to run what was then already a significant business, and they decided that they would go for professional management, and they hired somebody from the outside for the first time. And that was a guy by the name called Kelm, and he ran the company for, I think, over a decade. And then one of the 5 participants in that debate, Whitney McMillan, actually became our CEO. So they went from a situation where there was a non-family member CEO for a while, and then they went back to a family member becoming CEO. And at that, after Whitney, we've had multiple generations of people who are non-family members running the company. That, meanwhile, has been codified in a structure whereby we have a board where 6 family members are present, 6 independent members are present. So those are people who have enormous experience in the corporate world, and then we have 4 management members. So we have a fairly large board. And that board is very focused on how do we make sure that we maintain very good collaboration among all the stakeholders in order to preserve the continuity of Cargill as a private company.
That's interesting. I think in light of the fact that we're going to have a panel on independent directors immediately following your talk here, could you talk a little bit about the role that you see of independent directors? And some of them may be listening out there online, so you got to be a little careful. But what are they leaders? Are they followers? Are they just there to break ties? Or what's ideal, and what is your experience with that?
My experience with it is that they provide, first of all, an enormous wealth of experience for the management. The other thing that I think they help is they provide comfort for the family to help interpret what goes on in the company. And we are, as a management team, we're very focused on explaining to the family, look, if there's anything that is ever bothering you, just let us know. We'd much rather know than, because then we can do something about it. But I do think that for the family, it is helpful that there are independent board members to who you can listen to and use as a sounding board. So, hey, what this management team is saying, is that normal? Yeah, that's normal. And we've made a lot of changes over the last few years. And I think the independent members have been able to help the family sometimes better understand what goes on. Then the other thing is, I think our independent board members also are all acutely aware of the fact that they are board members of a family company. They are very supportive of the notion that we are private. So they are also interpreters from the family requirements as to, okay, this is what needs to happen inside the company. We are at the moment going through a interesting debate. So our financial performance is significantly increasing or significantly improving. And it's pretty logical that a debate is now coming on the table. Well, would we want to consider more transformational size transactions?
Interesting.
The largest transaction that we've ever done is a $2 billion deal, which is an enormous amount of money, but it is just a couple of percentage points of our enterprise value.
Well, you mentioned your M&A team has how many transactions sort of in the hopper at any given time?
So they counted it recently, and we were working on 60 transactions. So we are fairly acquisitive. With an 80% profit retention, then obviously you have an enormous amount of capital that you need to put to work. So if you just do the sums, if you make close to 10% return on equity and you have 80% profit retention, the company doubles every 6, 7, 8 years. And we've had some liquidity events, over the last 20 years. So it doesn't quite do that.
Right.
But you have an enormous amount of capital that you need to put to work. As a management team, we have a couple of years ago decided that we were going to spend less on organic growth, so build more factories, and we've rebalanced a little more towards inorganic growth, so buying other businesses and integrating them into the network. And as a result of that, now that the profitability is coming through, yes, we are becoming quite acquisitive.
Interesting. Now, you've had this great 150-year history. How long have you been at Cargill?
I'm coming up to 5 years.
So now we've got the next 150 years, which is going to be on your shoulders. Yeah. So what's the difference today of Cargill versus what it was in terms of ownership and participation and the like? What are the biggest challenges of the new Cargill, call it?
Yeah, well, let me first say that I personally and the people around me, we all feel very wedded to the notion that we are the custodians of 150 years of proud history. And we better make sure that we set the company up for the next 150 years. So, and I think that's a very useful reminder for everybody in the building. Some of the changes that we have made were hard. Some of the changes involved a significant impact on people. And you sit there and you think, okay, this is hard because it is very difficult to do it in a way that is in line with our values as an organization, but at the same time, we would be really remiss if we would have to look back 10 years from now and say, well, we failed to set the company up for success. So that's one. The second thing that I think is important is our industry has had relatively little disruptive impact. So I told you about retail, I told you about telecommunications. I've been involved as a non-executive board member in other businesses. And a lot of industries get subjected to really big disruptive forces. And if you think about it, the grain industry and the food ingredient industry has not been fully disrupted. So we spend a lot of time as a management team, and increasingly so, thinking about, well, what could be the big disruption that knocks on our door? And how do we make sure that we future-proof our business? And how do we make sure that we are in the right businesses? A lot of the businesses that we are in face a fair amount of scrutiny. That means that we have to make sure that we position those businesses well, but we also have to think through as to, okay, what could happen in this industry? So recently we made an announcement that we were investing in Memphis Meats. Memphis Meats is a company that creates cultured meat. So it creates meat without having to use an animal. And that's interesting because we are one of the largest beef producers in the country. And the reason why we did that is because, well, we think that initiative could be a useful complement to our traditional business models. So we're playing on both sides. We're playing in the traditional protein business. We believe that there is always going to be a market for protein. We believe that in the protein market you can make enormous progress in terms of making that business model more sustainable. We're very focused on that. At the same time, we think that there is another market segment out there of cultured meat that maybe 20 years from now or 10 years from now is going to become sustainable. So that's
Interesting.
or is going to become significant. So that's a nice example of how we're trying to make sure that we're playing on all sides.
One thing you haven't mentioned is this. So you've talked about how the business is growing and doing better and better. Families grow at a different pace than businesses, and this is sort of a underlying theme in family business that oftentimes the family outruns the business. Could you give people a picture of what the shareholder base looks like today and what it might look like in 2 generations, and is this a challenge?
Yeah, so we currently have about 100 shareholders, and we're now moving into a generation that has never worked inside the company. So the family members who are coming off the board in the next 10 years are all people who used to work in the company. And they are being succeeded by their children who have never worked in the company. And that's a slightly different dynamic, because if you've been in the company, obviously you have an emotional bond with the business, and you know what a grain elevator is, and probably you've also been in a food ingredient business, and you've probably lived in a couple of countries. So you have a well-versed perspective on what Cargill does. So one of the things that I think we need to make sure is that this new generation is emotionally very bonded to the Cargill system. Because they will always ask themselves the question, hey, is it the right thing to do to put all my eggs in one basket? And I think that they will come up with the answer that that is the right thing to do if they have real conviction that this is a good business to be associated with. So in talking to younger members of the family, I normally tend to say, look, you can spend as much or a little time as you have to get yourself acquainted as to what we do. This is a very large business. I don't have an expectation that you read all of the material that we are presenting to you. I do hope that we can convince you that we do good things. And I do hope that we can actually make you proud of what we do. For some of them, their name is above the door. And I do hope that we can convince you that there is an emotional bond to be had with this business, because I think that's ultimately what will help us to stay private.
Now you've had a whole bunch of illustrious family leaders, the most recent being Whitney McMillan. I was curious, there's a concept of a family champion, and in the next cadre of family members along, are there possibilities of a family champion emerging that really not just necessarily runs the company, but keeps everybody on the same page in terms of values?
I don't see anybody, nobody has raised his or her hand to me. We have some of these very younger shareholders, and you talk to them, and you think, wow, I'd like to have this one in my corporate FP&A department, and then we'll see what happens. Some of them are very smart, very well educated. It's not that we're driving towards that, and I do think that the only thing we would be guided by is merit. So we have a discussion with one younger family member who has worked in the business and who is currently contemplating whether or not he'd like to come back for a couple of years to learn. And I've said to him, that's great if you come back, but we'll just treat you just as we treat everybody else. in the rough and tumble that we have here on the corridor.
Great.
And and it,
So no favoritism.
no,
it's
no,
just
none.
On the merits.
None.
That's great.
And I think it would be helpful because not so much from a point of view that the company needs to be run by a family member. I think that's maybe, but that's not the agenda. The agenda is to make sure that people understand what the business is all about and that they have a passion for the business.
Good. Now, I'm going to, warning to the audience, we're going to open it up to questions in a second, and what I don't want to have happen is what always happens, is you open up for questions and everybody just sits there and stares at us. So we would love a few of you, and I'll call on you if I have to, because I know who you are out there, that always have very nettlesome questions, and we welcome those. So a couple of more from up here, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So staying private, shareholders who want liquidity. How does that work in a company of this size? You've had two, just maybe give the audience a little background, you've had two liquidity situations which you've handled very well. Maybe talk about that, and then how do you prepare for the future on this, and what's your thinking on staying private?
So let's first briefly talk about the two liquidity situations. The first one was the ESOP, the establishment of the ESOP in the 90s, and I don't necessarily think that, well, that was, liquidity was a part consideration, but the other part of the consideration was we have to create alignment between management and a broader group of employees with shareholders. So we distributed ESOP shares through a fairly large group of people, and they've all done very, very well.
I'd say so, yeah.
So that was helpful, and it served that dual purpose. Then, about a decade ago, one of the largest shareholders passed away, and she bequeathed her shares to a foundation. And that foundation basically said, look, we love the company, it's great, but we have our own goals, and we don't want to be long-term shareholders, so we'd like to have liquidity. And the company then came up in response to that with a transaction where part of our business was separated out from the portfolio and was listed, and that provided liquidity for our family shareholders, in particular that group or that branch that needed liquidity for the reasons just explained. I think what we have learned from that is that you have to plan in advance. Mm-hmm. So we keep track of people's liquidity needs, and obviously we keep that very close to our chest. But we know that there is a register where we keep track of, if this or this happens with these and these family members, then these are the amounts of money that we may need. We keep track of that, and that helps manage it from a need point of view. So that's the need issue, and that's fairly doable, I think. I tend not to get too involved in that. I hear the numbers from time to time, and I say to my boss, that's a rounding error, not a problem. Don't worry about that. Then I think there is the issue of what is it that people want. And we now have 100 shareholders, and the bigger your group becomes, the more inevitable it is that people will have different preferences. And that's okay, and I think we should start planning for that as well.
Interesting.
So I think we should carefully start to plan for a little more flexibility. But that's a bit of a balancing act, because if you create a lot of flexibility, then you may create an inadvertent and unintended inclination to use that liquidity. So the fact that it's a little boxed in is not necessarily a bad thing. Right. So when you talk to some of our shareholders, they will say, sometimes it's a little uncomfortable, but sometimes it's actually quite good because it keeps everybody in that box.
Interesting.
And then the last element, of course, is we pay a good dividend.
Isn't that the key? I mean, to keep everybody happy, the dividend at least. Yeah,
yes, and if I ran some numbers a while ago. If you assume that everybody has 3 children, and that the generation passes from, over a time frame of 25 years, I ran it quickly and I came to something like 7.5% of dividend growth in order to make sure that the next generation is equally well off as the prior generation, and it becomes complicated.
No, that's about right.
You have to make you have to make inflation assumptions and then inheritance tax, and so it's fairly complicated. But let's assume 7.5%, and that should be doable. I am always a little wary of companies, public companies, who say, well, we are going for double-digit EPS growth. 7.5% I think is okay. And we have about a 1% dividend yield, which means that our share price accretion should be through the cycle, and currently we're at a very high peak of the cycle, should be something like 6.5%. And that's doable. And if you do the sums, we did an exercise which we called triangulation. So we looked at how much, what was our return relative to our cost of capital 10 years ago, and how much above the cost of capital were we 10 years ago, and how much money should we be making if we go back to that level of profitability. We did a calculation where we looked at our share price and said, look, if you want to hit that 6.5% value accretion over a decade, where should we be, and what does that mean in terms of our profitability? And all of those different calculations come to the view that we still have work to do, so in terms of improving our profitability with our existing asset base.
Interesting.
So whenever I'm up on a stage talking to our employees and managers, I'll say, yeah, great progress. We are making a lot more money than we were making 3 years ago, but unfortunately it is still not enough. We still have more work to do. So congratulations, and let's all celebrate, but let's all recognize that we still have work to do.
A lot of family businesses have a challenge of bringing in non-family members to take significant positions, and I think one of the biggest barriers is how do you incentivize the non-family member? Maybe you talk about that generally at Cargill. Obviously, you've been very successful at this yourself and the team that you have, and this has been going on for a long time. How do you do it at Cargill?
So our compensation package is basically a compensation that is aligned with what you would get from a public company. So I came out of Sara Lee. I had a 10-minute conversation with our then CEO, Greg Page, and he described to me, Marcel, you're going to get options and RSUs, and I think he had an expectation that I would sit on that and ponder and play with it and come back. And I called him up. I went to my wife and said, this is what it looks like. And I was talking to other companies as well. And I went to my wife and we said, yeah, that sounds okay. So I called him up and said, that's okay, I'm in. And they found that a little odd because they were a little worried that, we're hiring a CFO and isn't he supposed to, negotiate some of his compensation? And the reason why that was an easy decision, because it's very recognizable.
That's great.
I actually do believe that as a private company, it would be interesting to think about some things that we could structure to create very explicit and long-term alignment between very senior managers and our shareholders.
Is there more being done on that in the field? I mean, are you getting good?
Well, we currently have a package that is very much aligned with what you see from public companies, and we have shares, and we do a calculation once a quarter as to what those shares are worth, and so I have options, and I have performance stock units, and I have restricted stock units. That's the way we currently construct it, but I will sometimes whisper into people's ears, I wouldn't mind being obliged to hold some of the stock like really long time.
No, that's interesting. That's interesting.
But that's a little bit of a personal thing.
I hear it, but it is great for alignment. I wish more public companies did.
Yeah, and so I think I would advise everybody in the room that there are two considerations. One is you have to be competitive in the talent market. At the same time, this notion of alignment, I think, is very, very important, because once there is a sense in the building that you're misaligned, I think that's pretty much the end of your ability to stay private. there is always, in a company that is managed by non-shareholders, there is always this potential for an agency problem. And I think you have to be very deliberate in making sure that that problem doesn't come to the surface either through behaviors. So I think everybody needs to be very focused on, hey, is everybody behaving in the right way? And at the same time, just making sure that everybody is really aligned.
As I sit here and listen to you, I'm going to look over at Dean Taylor in a second. If you're looking for somebody to be the Koch family business professor, I think we found him on our stage. So this is pretty impressive. So one final question, and then we'll open it up. What would be your advice to family business owners in the room, they're filling the room, and students, I guess, in terms of, and maybe you said it, but the most important thing to run a successful family business? Now, with 5 years of experience in the largest one in the United States, what would you share with them? Alignment clearly is right up there. But
yeah, alignment is important, but that's something that you continuously have to work on. I think that is always a subject of making tweaks. So making sure that you stay on top of the behaviors, making sure that you talk about if there is an appearance of misalignment, get that out of the room, because I think it can fester and it can become a real problem. I've already said it, look, we are the proud custodians of 150 years of history, and I would feel very embarrassed if we wouldn't set the company up for the next 100 years. And a big part of that, I think, is the value system. So the values have to be reinvented. And
that's great.
Cargill used to say our word is our bond, and then I think 10, 15 years ago we wrote our guiding principles, and we will have meetings where people will read from letters that Whitney Macmillan would send into the company about, we always do the right thing. And in Cargill, people tell each other stories. Famous story is we lost an enormous amount of money in the Russian meltdown in 15, 20 years ago, and one of the family shareholders came in and was explained that, yes, sorry, we lost an enormous amount of money, and he had only one question, and that was there any bad behavior? And the answer was no, there was no bad behavior, and he said, okay, then that's fine.
Interesting.
So we tell each other stories about behavior and values, and I think they need to be reinvented. So, over the last decade, Cargill has made an enormous amount of progress in safety in the company. We care deeply about whether or not everybody goes home at the end of the working day safe and sound. And as a result of that, we have made tremendous progress.
That's great.
So despite the fact that we operate plantations and we operate very difficult businesses in very difficult geography, our average safety record is now better than the average of American industry. We have a slide that shows that 10 years ago, our fatality track record was worse than the average of the American industry. Now we are beating American industry despite the fact that we are operating in the most complicated geographies and we have the most complicated business models. There is not a meeting in Cargill that doesn't start with safety. So we start our board meetings to talk about safety. That is a value that has become very important to us. We are now working very hard to build diversity into our thinking. Diversity and inclusion. An enormous amount of debate and enormous amount of, well, how do we measure that and how do we make that better? So keep reinventing those values because they are, for different generations, they also have different meaning.
Right.
And it was interesting. So I witnessed recently, we had a meeting with some of our older shareholders and some of our younger shareholders, and issues were discussed. And it was pretty clear that these younger generation, they had different values in their head. So I think we have to make sure that we don't just say, well, we've always done the right thing and we have our guiding principles. I think we need to continue to evaluate what are values in the future.
Interesting.
Does that help?
That helps. Let's open it up to questions. Here's one up here. I see somebody waving their hand frantically on the aisle.
You're second. You're number two. Sorry.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
Where's number one?
Your admonishment has
Spencer,
worked.
right here. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Just curious, you talked a lot about like ESOP and RSUs and valuation. How do you value the company since it's private? I'm curious about
Yeah,
that.
so what we do is we ask Duff and Phelps, they come in once a quarter, and we give them a presentation on the results, and they then go away and run their magic, and they come up with a number. So once a quarter we get a share price, and that share price is derived principally from the EBITDAs that we're generating in the different segments. We help Duff and Phelps understand what is the trend line number, and then they go away and do their magic, and they give us a number. And I think it's very important that as a management we should stay away from that process. So my view is, we do that quarterly meeting. I tell you what I know. I tell Duff and Phelps exactly the same thing as I tell our board. I tell Duff and Phelps exactly the same thing as I tell the rating agencies, because we have publicly traded debt. And then whatever number comes out, I shrug my shoulders and say, it's fine, it's okay.
So it's market-based EBITDA, or is it book value?
No, it's market-based EBITDA.
With a liquidity discount in there somewhere? Or?
Yeah, and there is a liquidity discount, which is interesting. So that liquidity discount was changed, and I think that was a unintended source of some misalignment. Let me put it that way, because people had options and equity instruments, and then the discount decreased, and so all of a sudden your options are worth more, and you haven't done anything to create more value. It's just Duff and Phelps who changed the discount for all sorts of really good reasons, by the way. So when I heard that story, I made a note to self: never talk about the discount. It is what it is. It's fine. And
Consistency is probably the most important.
Yeah,
thing.
consistency is
even if it's
because
wrong.
you get your options and your RSU with a discount, and when it comes out at the other end of the tunnel with the same discount, it's a wash. Right. So who cares about the discount? Just pick any number. What do I care? Pick a number and use it throughout the duration of your options and your RSUs and your PSUs, whatever instrument you want to use. So it's an important process. We have done some work recently around, is this the most tax efficient way of doing it? Because I had the impression that the reason why we had created real shares was because we had been a little too focused on we've got to have the same instruments as public companies have, and I was thinking, well, why don't we just have phantom shares? And isn't that more tax efficient? That became a very complicated study in a hurry, and the answer was it's pretty much the same thing. So I was a little worried that we had created real shares in order to get the right accounting treatment and not the volatility that comes with phantom shares. Because once you have phantom shares, it immediately creates volatility in your US GAAP reported numbers. And real shares don't have that volatility. It's fairly technical beyond the scope of this conversation. So I was reassured that no, from a tax point of view, this is an efficient mechanism, and it works well from an accounting point of view. It doesn't generate too much volatility in our earnings. So it works well for us.
So that's a lesson in how simple family businesses are. What's the next question we have out there? Yeah.
I have a question about Cargill's grain operations. Can you tell us a little bit about exports and which countries purchase the most amount of grain?
Yeah, so as I said, the origin of our company is we take agricultural commodities from countries of surplus to countries of deficit. The largest country of surplus used to be the United States, of course. The share of the United States in creating exports or creating surpluses that are exported has very significantly declined over the last 15 years. And nowadays, Brazil and Argentina are huge agricultural exporters, and also the Ukraine. We, as a company, are, I think, the largest exporter in Argentina, which means that if we need the Minister of Finance, we can call him or her up, and he or she will actually pick up the phone. That's the good news. The bad news is if the Minister of Finance in Argentina needs money, he or she will call us. And this is literally true. Big flows go from Latin America to China, and also from the former Soviet Union. So we are in the Ukraine. I was a year into Cargill, and I sent my children a little picture of a sunflower field with all these beautiful yellow sunflowers, and the turrets of a number of tanks were sticking out of the sunflowers. And I sent them a picture and said, "This is the business that your dad is now working in." And, so we had a crush plant in the Ukraine. And at one point, somebody turned up on our doors and said, "We think you owe us tax because we are the new government in this part of the country." And we said, "No, we don't think so." So we halted that operation. We kept the people on our payroll for a very long time, hoping that operation would turn for the better. Unfortunately, it didn't, so we lost that plant. And the reason why I'm telling you that story is because we have to be in countries where there are big agricultural surpluses, however difficult they are from a political or socioeconomic point of view. So we have to be in Brazil, we have to be in Argentina. I speak Spanish at home. My wife is from Venezuela, so when I joined the company...
And you're Dutch.
Yeah, so when I joined the company, my colleague said, "You speak Spanish from now on, you're the Latin American director." So I do tend to spend a little bit of time in navigating the Latin American countries. Ukraine, I've had a little bit of involvement in. So it takes us into very complicated geographies.
Let's go to Paul Koch in the front row. Paul?
How do you handle the transfer of stock between generations, and what do you do with difficult situations on stock ownership of, say, divorce and creditors levying on it? How do you keep it within the family?
Yeah, so to be perfectly honest with you, as the CFO, I try and stay away from that subject of divorces and stuff like that.
That's
I'm serious about that. So I know that the family has a family office, or part of the family has family office. They're called Waycross. They sit in our building. So we have a little area in our office complex where they sit. And the family is very active with trusts and planning and estate planning and making sure that we don't run into situations like that, or at least that whenever we run into those situations that we can deal with them. I know that a fair amount of technology, tax planning technology, is deployed in order to make sure that we manage that well. I hope you don't mind that I try and stay away from it. So I see it as my role to make sure that the company is set up for the next 150 years, and I see it as my role as an incoming CFO. And I will make jokes to people and say I'm the head bookkeeper of this place. So when I came in, I pushed really hard on, hey, we're not making enough money. We are a stakeholder company, and we are justifiably very proud of being a stakeholder company. But if you're a stakeholder company and you're serious about being a stakeholder company, then you have to recognize that one of your most important stakeholders are your shareholders. And we had a slide that showed that we had gone up from deploying approximately 40 billion of our shareholders' money to 60 billion, and our profitability had been flat as a pancake. And we started to show that slide everywhere and said that's a problem, because our shareholders have left a significant amount of money in the business, and we are not giving them a return on that additional money. So in one of the first town halls that we did, I remember being on a stage like this, and it was my very first time that I was on the stage, and by the time I had said, we got to make more money, by the fifth time, one of my colleagues said, "I think they got it." So, and I, a year thereafter, I was in front of our shareholders in a shareholder meeting, and so we do a whole range of events for our shareholders. And I said, "Look, it's like really simple. We're making 2, and we should be making 3. So those are the 2 numbers that you may want to remember. We're making 2, we should be making 3. And that's where I focus."
Another question, Ken, is
Spencer.
that you back there?
I am here, yes. You mentioned the importance of maintaining the emotional bond with family members. Can you speak to the role of philanthropy in accomplishing that?
Yeah. That is a significant part of it. I think so we're very active in the Minneapolis community. We have a foundation that supports a whole range of initiatives. Most of our management members will be active in organizations. I am active in an organization called Junior Achievement, so this is my 15-second opportunity to plug the good work of Junior Achievement. We volunteer in schools. We help children understand the value of a business career. I've done that. I've been in front of 5th graders, which is kind of interesting because I'm used to people paying attention to me. That's not necessarily the case if you have 5th graders. So, there is a deep commitment to do activities like that. It's very deep in the business. So one of the businesses that reports up to me, I have one business that reports up to me, and that is our loan origination business. They will send a monthly letter, and they talk about here are the results, and then they talk about here are the things that we've done for the communities that we are in. That is a big part of it, but our notion of we're doing good is much broader, and it goes right back to our business models. So it is very easy to engage Cargill people around a central question, and that is how do we make sure that we can feed 9.5 billion people in a sustainable way by 2050. So in 2050, the world population is estimated to peak at 9.5 billion, approximately 9.5 billion people, and hopefully by 2050, the world has become entirely sustainable, and people are increasingly talking about the circular economy and. So our business model, the nature of our business, allows us to engage people around, well, we do good things not just on the philanthropy side, but we actually do good things with our business models. And if we can continue to evolve our business models, we can make a contribution to the environments that we're operating in. As the Chief Compliance Officer, let me just give you another one. I participate in an enormous amount of sessions where we try and explain to management why compliance is important. And I always start with saying compliance is important because it is a part of us doing good. If we can prove in a country where corruption is rampant, and corruption, by the way, is the biggest single impediment to growth in the developing world, if we can prove in a country like that we can conduct business successfully without ever resorting to corruption, we will make a massive contribution to the society that we are in. Because our business practices will get copied. Some of the people who will leave us and go and work in other organizations will say, I know you can do this. So that's another example of how can we make a positive contribution to the communities that we're in. It's our business models, the way we change our business models, how we make them more sustainable, the way we treat and educate our people, all of our stakeholders, the way we show up in a compliant way, and then, yes, there is also a component of philanthropy.
With that, I think we'll bring this session to a close. Marcel, I can't thank you enough for sharing your wisdom and experience at Cargill with the Olin School. So
thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take a 10-minute break. In 10 minutes, we're going to have the panel up here led by Mike DeCola from HBM Holdings on the role of independent directors in sustainable family businesses. So 9:15 or so, we'll restart. But Marcel, thank you. I'm pleased to introduce Mike DeCola, who's been a tremendous supporter of Olin in so many different ways, but in particular in family business. So I'll turn it over to him to talk to his panelists about the role of independent directors. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, that works.
Good morning. Not yet. There we go. Good morning. It's certainly, yeah, that was much weaker than Spencer's. But I'm not going to insult you by asking you to do it again. It's an honor to be here this morning to give you some insights around the role governance can play in creating a sustainable, high-performing organization. My name is Mike DeCola. As Spencer said, I'm currently president and CEO of HBM Holdings Company, a privately owned business here in St. Louis. We are really fortunate today to have a panel of accomplished and experienced leaders with an incredible breadth and depth of experience, as you'll come to learn as we talk through this topic. So you've had the opportunity to read their backgrounds in the program. I'm not going to bore you by repeating that, but I'm going to tell you some other things about our panelists. And I'm going to start with the gentleman on your far left. Like most of you, I know a lot of bankers in town. And literally every banker to whom I spoke said John Dubinsky is the best banker they've ever met. And I believe they all meant that as a compliment. But in addition to being a great banker, John's been an advisor, director, and observer of many public and privately owned businesses, both here and in other parts of the country. John, welcome to our panel. Glad to have you. Carol O'Neill has extensive general management track record in both public and private enterprises and has distinguished herself as a great leader. She relocated to St. Louis to run a packaging part of Spartec, a public company that went through some interesting dynamics while Carol was there. About 4 years ago, she joined Barry Waymiller, one of the largest and most respected private businesses in the country, as group president of Barry Waymiller's packaging business. If that wasn't enough, she's raising 3 teenagers, which we all know keeps one on one's toes, 2 of whom are in the college search process. So Carol has an understanding of stress that's different than the rest of us. She joined the Peace Corps to make the world a better place, and she's still working on that mission today from a different platform. Please welcome Carol O'Neill. Jeff Miller claims that he stumbled into the world of family-owned business 37 years ago and never looked back. He served as a leader at Markham Corporation, a 5th-generation family-owned business, for 27 years, retiring as president. In 2006, he led a process with the family shareholders. He led a process that concluded in the family shareholders' decision to sell the company, and he then managed the sale process. He now serves on several boards, public, private, and nonprofit. He's based in New Hampshire, spends his free time shoveling snow, building stone walls, and protecting his vegetable garden from invading critters.
This is true.
Jeff, welcome back to St. Louis for 2 weeks in a row.
Thank you.
So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes or so having a conversation about governance, advisors, and boards. And we'll leave ample time for questions, so you should begin thinking about those now. I'm a Darden grad, and we have a practice called cold calling, so if you thought it was threatening that Spencer might call you, be clear that I will absolutely do that. But we'd rather spend as much time on Q&A because we'd rather talk about stuff you find interesting than stuff we find interesting. As we prepared for our discussion today, we thought about the journey we could take you on through the broad topic of governance, hopefully in a way that provides you some nuggets that you can take back to help you run your business more effectively. We thought a good place to start would be sharing some thoughts about the concept of governance and the role that a director plays in that process. And so, Carol, we're going to ask you to get us started on how governance works and what role a board member plays in that process.
Okay. I would say I've had a couple of different experiences with governance, both as a president of a company with an outside board and being on boards of public companies and private companies. And when we started talking about governance in a family business, we did say, well, we probably should step back and talk about governance in general. Like, what role could a board of directors play? What role could independent directors play? And to me, I think it's all about, and we all have different views, so we'll hopefully interrupt each other and share them, but fundamentally, it's a lot around perspective, the perspective of people who are a little outside the day-to-day, perspective of people which hopefully have relevant, valuable external experience, which we talked a little about this morning. If it's the right board set up right, it's the perspective to think about the long term. In a family business, that might be generations of family members, but in any business, it's generations of team members and their families and their communities and all the people that rely on businesses to be around for the next 150 years, not just the past. So that longer term perspective is also pretty critical in any situation. And then I think, fundamentally, the board is there in some ways to make probably one of the more probably the most important decision that any business makes, public or private, which is that of succession. And it's the one sort of decision, I would say, that the current CEO is almost always not sufficiently well equipped to make. So I'd say to me, that's governance. That's the most important role that independent directors can play in any company of any size.
So I think there's an attitude that maybe big corporations and big public arenas have a different way of governing and a different structure, and the public company boards are bureaucratic and not very helpful. Jeff, could you talk a little bit about some of the really good things that public company boards practice that maybe a private business or a family business could benefit from?
Sure. So there's also, as Ronald Reagan said, a trust but verify. So there's a trust but verify role in public company governance that crosses over to private company governance. Shareholders, sure, they trust the management, but they'd like somebody helping to verify that management's doing a good job. So prior to thinking about succession, and in some cases driving a conversation about succession, is the role of evaluating the CEO. Certainly advising, counseling, but also evaluating, and if necessary, hopefully not in a family-owned company, terminating the CEO. There's an important audit role, which is bigger than a classic audit committee, but it's really making sure that the performance is what the performance is reported to be. There's an element of behavioral governance, which I find shows its head much more frequently in family companies, to the credit of family companies, but is equally important in public companies. Public companies, they rent their CEO, and sometimes renters don't behave as well as owners, and shareholders suffer the consequences. So part of what a board needs to do is keep its pulse on that element of the culture as well.
Mm-hmm. So John, you've had an interesting career in which you've gotten to observe family businesses, private businesses, and public businesses. Share some of your experiences with us and give us some examples that you've seen of both good and bad private company governance.
Okay, first I'd like to try two definitions. You can have, in my opinion, you can have a family business that's a public company. Family businesses aren't all small businesses. We heard about one today. But there are many examples of public companies that are family businesses. They just happen to have a whole group of additional shareholders, but it's still dominated or run by a family in a family way. And then secondly, I think I want to differentiate between many people in, we'll call it, smaller family businesses. They really want to think about having an advisory director. And I'm going to differentiate that from a legal director. And I think most of you and most of the conversation may relate to what I'll call advisory directors. I want to talk about legal directors of a family business. I guess I'm sort of a capitalist. I view, if I'm a legal director of a family business, the first thing I want to know is, what does the family want to accomplish? So the one thing I do where I've been involved one way or another is I go interview the family. And we heard today about a company that has 100 shareholders. I mean, if I were part of that group, I'd go interview as many of those 100 people as I could and say, what do you want to accomplish? Do you want to build the business? Do you want to grow the business? Do you want to sell the business? You just want a place to go to work? So going to the story side, I mean, I've been involved one way or another in family businesses that, let's take one owned by two brothers. They wanted, you know, some advice, we'll call it. One brother wanted to sell the business and move to Florida, and the other brother wanted a place to go to work every day and could care less what the business was worth, and he had no interest in selling the business. And they each owned 50%. Well, guess what? I mean, that's, you know, doesn't accomplish much. I've been in family businesses, my own family, my father's family. They were a family business. My father and his partner, my uncle, they hadn't really talked to each other for 20 years. They went to work together, but they never ever sat down and talked about, you know, where do we want to go and whatever. The good news, this is not a joke. You wanted stories. My father and my uncle, who were partners, they both died in the same year, so that actually was good from the standpoint of figuring out what to do with the family business, because neither of them, you know, were around to have to deal with it. In a legal sense, a legal director of a family business, from my standpoint, is there to serve the shareholders. Where you have a family business that's part public, it gets very complicated, because you probably have a dominant family and then you have some other shareholders. As a director, I take the role, from my standpoint, you're there to serve all shareholders. So you get down sometimes to issues of, there may be something that's in the interest of the family, but it's not in the interest of the minority shareholders. And one of the roles from my standpoint of a director is to try to sort that out and to make sure that what we'll call the company does the right thing. I was struck this morning by the speaker. I was fascinated. I don't know anything about their business or whatever. And I'm going back to my charge. I sort of had the feeling the speaker was talking about how management manages the shareholders. I would take the opposite view. The shareholders need to have a management team that will accomplish what the shareholders want to accomplish. So going back to what you said before, if you don't know what the shareholders want to accomplish, then you don't know what kind of management that you really want. But if you do know what the shareholders want to accomplish, then you can help them make sure you have the management that will accomplish that goals. Making it a little simpler, I agree with what was said before. Independent directors, if they have a wealth of experience, can be very helpful in making sure the company runs well, make sure management's paid well but not overpaid. That's an interesting dynamic. The biggest issue in family businesses, if I could say, with gray hair, is this generational change from the first to the second generation, and then what's even more difficult is the change from the second generation to the third generation. Because by the time you do that, you have what our speaker was talking about this morning. You have family members that are involved in the business and family members that are uninvolved in the business. The shareholders that are uninvolved in the business generally are rich on paper and have no money. And if I were going to just identify one issue that I think outsiders can help with, outsiders that have been around this before, this isn't their first rodeo. It's just like if you needed, knee surgery, you don't want to go to a guy or a gal that says, oh, I'm really happy you're here. You're my first patient I've ever done this operation on before. There are lessons to be learned from independent outside directors of how to help with this transition. And they're not easy. There's not one formula. It depends on a whole bunch of family dynamics. But that's the place that I think independent directors can help the most, which is to help deal with the issues within the family, within the shareholders, which have got to get resolved or the business just won't advance.
So Jeff, you've been on both sides of this as the outside executive running the business for a family, and now you're serving on a couple of family boards. Talk about what you've seen that's worked real well from both perspectives.
So I'm on some great family boards who recognized early on that there's a flip side of the statistic of family companies being 60% of the GDP and 60% of employment and 75% of new jobs, is that they're also endangered species and they die. So, which is I think why many of you are here. What about the statistics from first generation to second generation? 30% survive, then it goes down to 12, then it's down to 2 or 3. And that's not because the family wants the business to go away. It's, you know, what John was talking about, it happens. I've been on 2 family boards that recognized too late they needed a board. So if we're thinking it's good to wait until a crisis happens and then put an advisory board together and bring on some governance, you know, lots of luck. I could talk for hours about those experiences. So what works well is to recognize up front what you want as a family business and a board. The good news is generally the shares are narrowly controlled, so if you don't like your board, you can get rid of them. Even if they're a legal board, if they're an advisory board, you can get rid of them at will. Families ruin businesses, and businesses ruin families in family businesses. That's what happens. And an advisory board can do a lot more than just provide advice. The right advisory board also, you know, part of a board's role, even in a public company, is to take the heat. But in a private company, there's a big element of taking the heat. It's part of the job. A private company director, I think, is everything that a public company director is if it's done right, and then with a whole bunch more stuff added on top. It is really fun and really complex, and it's really important to get it right.
Well, I think they take the heat, and then they also create a place for you, if you're a leader of a business, to hold yourself accountable and to hold your team accountable. And I know one of the things I always feel like is when you have to present your business, or your team has to present your business to the board, it forces them to step back and say, okay. You know, a lot of us get so caught up, everyone in any business, big or small, gets caught up in the day-to-day running the business. And sometimes when you have to step back and say, okay, I have to share this with my board of directors, I have to be held accountable to someone beyond myself, it's good for a business to go through that process. So they can force you to play your game at a higher level, and they can challenge you, and they can be the bad guy sometimes. You can say, well, I'm sorry, but the board won't let me do it, which is a sort of cheap trick leadership thing. But people do it, and some people need it.
And occasionally everybody.
And occasionally you need it, especially if it's a complex family environment. When you need somebody who's not a family member to help weigh in on something that has got so much emotion backed into it from a family perspective that it's hard to be objective and rational and balanced. And so it's helpful to have some people who care about the business, care about the long term, care about the team members, care about the shareholders, but are able to be a little less emotionally connected to the decisions that have to be made.
So Mike asked me to, maybe tell some stories. I could tell a couple stories that may or may not hit home with you. I mean, I was involved with one family business where the family basically knew that the patriarch of the family had cancer and didn't have too long to live, and what they really wanted to do was to bring a better management team in, run the business better, and sell the business. So what the outside directors did in that company to help them is to help them find the right CEO, non-family member CEO, and then help them find a buyer for the company. And the experience of the family and of the, if you please, family board, they had no experience in doing this. So one of the things that the outside, there were I think 2 or 3 of us could do, was we had experience, so we knew how do you go out and find a CEO? What are the characteristics of the CEO? How do you find a buyer? How do you find people that can help the family figure out what's a fair price for the company, negotiate the proper contracts, et cetera. Another situation that I've been involved in, I actually believe that if family members will talk to each other, in some cases, that they can find lots of middle ground. I mean, but they don't talk very often. So one of the things that you talked about, just the fact of having meetings, having a board meeting, having just the fact that at a board meeting, at least the other directors, members of the family, will see how the business is doing. It's amazing the number of family businesses where you have a large shareholder who may or may not be active in have no idea how the business is doing. How much money did we make last year? What do we pay in taxes? How does the new tax law affect us? So one of the values of maybe professionalizing a little bit is you have transparency within the family. So I'm a big believer that if people have information, they'll make better decisions. So if the family has better information, I think they will make better decisions.
So let's assume that we've convinced every family business in the audience that creating an independent board, whether it's advisory or governance, is a good idea. How do you go about finding the right people?
I actually thought about that this morning. I think the first thing the family ought to do is to decide what skills do we not have in the family that we'd like to bring on to our team. In a lot of businesses, the family really knows how to make the widget. It's the other things that they don't have any experience in. So I would argue that then you look for an advisory director or a real director, it doesn't make any difference, or a consultant that can bring experience in that to the table. Experience in either personnel or executive compensation, or how do I find a buyer? So I think the answer is you want to bring, what you don't want to do, with due respect to all of you that are lawyers, you don't, in my opinion, you don't want to bring the family lawyer and view that person as, well, now I have an outside director. That's a different skill set than perhaps what people need. So
You don't
again,
need all of the members of the CEO's wedding party.
Yeah.
It's good to have friends,
Yeah.
but it's not good to have, it's not good to be, even if, it's not good to be all of your best friends in life.
So talk about why that's a bad idea.
Well, it's a bad idea for a lot of reasons. I mean, but if you want to have an independent, you should absolutely go for talent and complementary experience outside the business. But you want to have people that you believe care about the business, so that's where friends come to mind instantly. Everyone's got smart friends who are good business people. But the other thing is, if you really want them to be independent, then you need them to be able to have the tough conversations. And they need to be able to say, John's really awesome, but I'm not sure at 28 he's really ready to run a $4 billion company, Or, those kinds of conversations are sometimes hard to have when you've been vacationing with your best friend and his wife and their kids since everyone was, 22, and now you're in your 60s. It's not that there's a lot of issues around that make it hard for that independent director to be the independent director you need him or her to be.
I'd add small ego. Sense of humor is always good in a family company if you're not in the family. And the ability to work well and support, and at the same time evaluate the CEO over a long period of time. CEO tenure in family companies, not surprisingly, is something like 4 to 5 times that of CEOs in public companies. So you're in it for the long haul. So and nothing is better than really good references and intensive interviewing, because you're bringing somebody into the family when you're bringing an independent director into your family business, I think, if you're doing it right.
I think when you look for a director, you ought to look for the same characteristics that hopefully you will look for as senior management.
Yeah, a key leader.
A very successful track record. Yeah. I'm a big believer that, if you want to bring a skill onto your business, whether it be in management or as a director, find somebody that's been very successful and has some expertise in an area that you need in your company. Don't just go out and, sort of go to the next party and meet a friend. What are you doing? Well, I'm sort of retired. Well, you want to spend a couple hours, coming over to our family business? That's not the right, process to find the person. And by the way, for those of you that aren't involved, and I don't even know about you all, a lot of directors, whether they be advisory directors or real directors of family businesses, most good companies, we'll try that are interested in that, are willing to compensate these people appropriate to their talents and what they bring to the table. So, if you want somebody that's going to be a material factor in a big company, you're not going to go out and find the right person as a director and say, well, how about you come to these meetings and I'll give you $100. It's just not going to happen. It's a different world. People don't do this necessarily for friendship anymore.
Well, I think if you're serious about them being successful, you need to, if you're serious about the board and the role it can play, you need to pick the right people, and then you need to kind of set them up for success. They need to be talented and successful in their business, and they need to be willing to spend some time getting to know yours. Someone who kind of waltzes in, reads the board package in advance, spends a few hours and walks out, probably isn't going to be what you're going to want for a family board where you want people thinking about it for generations. And they're going to have a learning curve, so they need to be willing to spend the time. And then you need to set them up with with the right information to have the visibility to the business that you would want people to have, and you need to give them visibility to your team members, so they're seeing not only do you have a strategy, and are you delivering the numbers, but do you have the talent to execute the strategy? I mean, for them to really do the job well, they've got to be set up to do the job.
We talked, John, you talked a little bit, and Carol, you did too, about the role a board plays in CEO succession. But let's talk a little bit about board succession and how that can be managed in a family business. I think Marcel talked about that a little bit earlier today.
This is going to sound sort of strange. I'll go back to what I said before. In my sort of thought that if you're a legal director of a family business, the family's going to decide that. You can try to influence the family, but you know, I really believe that a director in a family business, a real family business, is there to represent the family, the shareholders, and so you try to help the family do the right thing, but ultimately it's their decision. But you can make recommendations, and you know, some management team love directors. I mean, I've been on both sides of this too. And I'll be honest, I've felt this way where I've been involved. You know, some boards have good relationships with management, and some boards have bad relationships with management. And some managements have good relationships with boards, et cetera. What you want to do, you know, the infamous word is, if you can, is to align the interests. But that's not easy. It is really, really, really hard to be a director of a business. I'd much rather be a CEO of a business than a director. Why do I say that? If you're the CEO, theoretically, the final decision is yours. If you're a director, your role, let's say you have a 9-person board, your role is to try to convince the other 8 directors, or most of them at least, that your point of view is the best point of view. That's really hard work sometimes. And but I think objectivity. I think, you know, objectivity in terms of who you hire for management, how much you pay them. I've been involved in a couple family businesses where management welcomed independent directors because the independent director's point of view was that management should be paid competitively. That may not have been the exact view of the family, you know. And you know, the result is, in a lot of cases, you know, the independent directors, you know, cause salary surveys to be done and, you know, job descriptions to be compared, and then you go to the board or whatever and you say, look, here are the facts. You know, we're paying, you know, Sue or Charlie, you know, $450,000, but that skill set is worth $750,000. So you can be very helpful by opening the family or the other board members' eyes to, you know, what's appropriate.
I think when you ask the question about succession of boards, I guess I do think in several of the situations I've seen, family boards or private company boards, family or not, tend to be a little more clubby than public company boards. And I think it's really hard sometimes to have because they tend to be handpicked by the CEO, hopefully well, you know. But even if I've handpicked a board, you know, 25 years later, is it still the right board? But it's hard in a family company because we don't usually set up governance with the same structures you would in a public company board, where they're elected and they have terms and that kind of thing. So I would say, you know, I think one of the questions Mike asked us in advance, what are some great practices that you could learn from public company boards? And my first gut reaction when I saw the question was, none. And then I thought back and thought, well, there actually are some really good practices in public company boards, and one of them is terms. You know, it's not bad to have a conversation. If you have a term, then I can sit down with John and say, hey, you know, do you want, you know, your 3-year term is up. Do you want to be on this board for another 3 years? And maybe he says, you know, I'm wanting to spend more time in Florida. So it just gives us an opportunity. I don't want to kick him off the board, but it gives me an opportunity and him an opportunity to have a dialogue about where this role plays in his priorities at this stage. So I would say there are a couple public company practices related to boards, including like terms, that I think if I was sitting in the audience and I hadn't set up a board and I was about to do it, I'd say talk to people about 3-year terms. It just lets you have a conversation, makes it easier for everybody to have a conversation about whether this is really a priority for both of you now moving forward at this stage in the company's life cycle.
My family company boards have all had 1-year terms,
There you go.
which is a practice public companies are being forced to adopt and struggle. I mean, they prefer to have 3-year multiple overlapping terms so no one can really ever take control from the disenchanted shareholder groups. Yeah. And another element of family company boards to consider, particularly those that have gone into multiple generations, is bringing non-management family members on board, which has been the case with 2 of the family boards with which I've engaged. And it's great from back to that trust but verify thing, but you get a lot of engagement, you get that communication out. So it's not only happening from your independent directors, but you have family members on board. Another whole level of challenge, but I think everyone who has been part of that experience would agree it's been very rich, very good for the business, very good for the family.
And I just say one more thing, and I'm not sure most businesses in general and most family businesses for sure have realized this. I mean, the business world is changing rapidly, and I'm not sure those of us in this room even understand really, well, how do millennials think? And in a lot of businesses, they're realizing they don't understand how women think. And in a lot of other businesses, they're realizing that a big part of their customers are minorities, but they may not understand how minorities think. And so as the markets change, whether it be at a board level or management, but I guess we're here to talk about boards, it's probably pretty good to try to figure out a way to have voices speaking to how, what's going on, what are these changes? And so that everybody can take them into account in making decisions. But, in general, depends on the business, obviously. The world is changing rapidly, and companies to survive, which should be theoretically the goal, they need to change also. But if we don't understand who the new customers are, in some of the stuff I've done, for instance, I've just been shocked at, how differently what are called millennials think from the way I think. And it's just, it's different, it's generational, it's a whole bunch of things. But I think what I've learned is I need to take some time. Let's say I'm a board member. One way or another, the board needs to have a voice at the table expressing the views of, of new voices and new customers.
So I'm going to give the folks in the back of the room a 2-minute warning on getting the microphones ready for questions. And we'll end with, we talked a little bit about this in our call last week. In general, do family businesses make good use of their outside advisors? Or maybe even in specific cases of areas where you've seen great use of advisors, and maybe some situations where they have people that show up to these meetings, but they're just not listening to them.
I don't know that. I think the answer to that is as broad as, do people as individuals make good use of their advisors? And there are management teams that really know how to listen carefully and critically, pick the value that's there and use it. And that's the one end of the scale. And then there are others who have their opinions and they know they're right, and they may do you the favor of listening politely, and don't. It's all over the board. There are family companies, they're public companies that have boards because they have to, or they think it looks good. It looks good. I have a board. Look at this, with good people on it. But the board meets for 3 hours, 3 times a year, and discussion is about 5 minutes long. So yeah, there's a right answer. I think there's a right answer to what should be, but in terms of what is, I suspect it's across the board.
No, I've seen across the board. I've seen, in some ways you would think, well, an advisory board, I wouldn't have an advisory board if I didn't want the advice. So presumably I'm going to get the advice and then I'm going to listen to it. And I was president of a company, which is a privately held company with, you could call it a family company, it sort of was. But the owner-founder had a phenomenal board, all outside directors, only 4 of them, people who'd been tremendously successful in their careers and very prominent citizens. This was in Chicago. Gave phenomenal advice, which the owner, founder, CEO, who happened to be a woman, chose to ignore. To the point, and then the board had brought me in. And after a while, it was pretty clear, I'm not fixing a dysfunctional company, I'm working for one. And it isn't all that fun. My hands are like this, and it doesn't make sense. And I went to the board members before I went to the CEO and said, I've been recruited for this opportunity in St. Louis, and I feel terrible because you brought me in, but I don't think you're kind of getting your money's worth because I'm not able to have the impact on this organization that I can have and should have. And so I think I need to at least take this opportunity seriously and would like to be a reference. And they said to me, you're right, we'll give you a great reference, we're sorry. And they literally got off the board before I even left the company. Because they said, you know, this isn't worth it. You know, the compensation is like beer money for these guys, you know, $25,000 a year or something. And they weren't given advice. They saw the opportunity to create a sustainable business, and they weren't actually able to do it. So they're like, well, we're not going to do this anymore, and they didn't. But I've seen other cases where a family business really wants the advice, and I feel like in some cases those are better uses of my time as a director than situations where the family business doesn't know why they have a director. I mean, I've had conversations with CEOs where I've said, why are we doing this? What do you want me to play? What role do you want the board to play? Because I'm not sure this agenda is going to get that. And I've had other cases, I'm on Tom Hillman's board, and I know that he wants input and advice, and he wants to be challenged, and we have a very robust dialogue. So it's kind of all over the place. Barry Waymiller has probably the best vision, has the best fundamentals for a board because it's very much like a public company board. But it's a private company, and they've applied a lot of the disciplines. So it feels like we've got, I'd say, 80% of the foundation. There's probably a little tweaking you could do to make it even more impactful. But it's all, like you say, it's all over the map. It really depends on what the president or the leader of the company really wants.
The only thing I'd add is, again, from my perspective, in a lot of businesses, you know, the family businesses, medium-sized businesses, that you just have to deal with issues of the family. And from my standpoint, the biggest challenge, which I like, how do you bring the family together? How do you bring the family to, you know, to work together, to have a common set of goals, or if they don't have a common set of goals, at least find a business plan that'll work. I mean, they're not here, but I mean, I got to be a little bit friendly with what's called the Walker family in Minneapolis. You've all heard of the Walker museums, et cetera. They're basically a timber family. And I don't know, they're in the third generation or fourth generation. From a family standpoint, it is totally dysfunctional. And they're members of the family that, you know, want to build the business. They're members of the family that want to sell. It's a very big business. They want to sell the business. There are many members of the family that are multi-millionaires on paper, but the company doesn't pay any dividends, so they have no money. I mean, it's not a good situation. So you know, what I like about family businesses is trying to take on the challenge of how do you bring the family together. And as you get more and more family members, you know, our speaker today talked about they have 100 family members, it gets more difficult. But if the business is going to survive, you're going to have to deal with that.
Great. Well, let's open the floor up for questions that I know you've been saving. Spencer?
Well, I've got one, and I've got my little sign here, too. The thing that I find just sort of interesting is all three of the panelists have articulated roles that a great director can play and should play, but the fly in the ointment is that the CEO is the one that, or the owner, comes out and hires the directors, and I've never seen a job description for an independent director that actually articulates what they exactly are responsible to do. I find that they tend to be the friend of the CEO, and their role is ambiguous day one. And so I'd love advice from you on how to transition from that ambiguity to more of a definitive job description.
Could everybody hear that? Because he broke the rule and asked the question before we got a microphone to him. Could you all hear that? Yeah. So Spencer basically asked, how do you transition from an ambiguous, amorphous concept of I want to hire my best friend or my neighbor onto my board to one in which you have a full-fledged position description with expectations and responsibilities and background and experience? So.
Is that 5 minutes, Spencer, to answer this question, or?
No, he has the wrong sign because we're in good shape.
So I think the best place to start is you start pretending you want to hire a public company director, and there, you know, you can Google you can Google job descriptions for that in 2 minutes and go for that. And I've had 50% of the companies which I've been on the board on a private company side, 2 of them did it that way. And I'd say their boards reflect that in terms of quality and expectations. And 2 were, well, who do we know who might know something about business and can get to the meetings in 10 minutes because they live down the street. And if that's your orientation, you're probably never going to bother to do the Google search on the public company board. To the comments we heard earlier about, do you hire your country club friends or do you hire people who can be there for the long term and deliver the quality? So it's accessible, but you have to start with that desire.
Yes, sir. Don. Well, Don's going to wait for the microphone. Thank you, Don. That's great.
Do you all feel, when looking for directors in a family business, that they should, if you're looking at this pool, that they should have had experience of being on other family businesses? Or does it matter? I mean, if you're looking at directors and they have, say, publicly
if I could just jump in, it's to me a good analogy. I mean, if you need heart surgery, do you want to go to somebody that says, this is the first time I've done this, but you're welcome? I mean, you do develop skills of being a director. You develop, your own feel for, how you can be most effective. So my argument is, just like anything else, if you have the option, you want to hire somebody with experience in the area that you want them to contribute to the business. And you don't want the person that's doing it for the first time. And at the same time, you may not want somebody, I'm retired and I've been retired for 10 years, and you don't want that either. But you do want somebody, I think, with experience, if you can.
I guess one thing, this might be sacrilege to say in this context, but I think one question I would have is, how do you think about your business first and foremost? Is it a family business, or is it a business that happens to have been passed down through generations with family members working in it? And so what are you looking for in your board? Are you looking for someone who is going to help you run a better family business, whatever that is? Or are you going to put someone on your board who's going to help you build the best, to take this business that you have and make sure it's the most robust, long-term, sustainable business that it can be? I mean, Marcel talked a bit about diversity and sustainability and kind of the obligation to family members because so much of their wealth is tied up in it. So clearly that's a piece of what you think about when you're running a family business. But I think you're looking for the person who can be the complementary group of people, hopefully not too big, who can really help you build the best, most sustainable long-term business. And whether they've been on a family board before or just another board before, I don't know that it matters as much. Presumably you're going to have a mix of people. Not every one of them has to have been on a family business. But it really kind of goes back to, what do you think about the business? What are your aspirations for the business? Is it just a place for your kids and grandkids to come to work? Then that's a different type of thing. Or are you bringing someone on the board to navigate the fact that the cousins don't get along with each other and can't talk? Then they better be really versed in family business dynamics, because that's what they're going to spend their time on. But if your aspiration is for someone to come in and help you build the best business you can build, I don't know that it's as important that they have family business background as that they have business director kind of experience.
I agree. Business trumps family. But you want to make sure they're not insensitive.
Yeah. Business trumps family, or unless you want to be the statistics that you cited before.
Again, my challenge with stories. I'll give you a story that is just, you got to work your way through it. Nice family business. Son-in-law of the husband of one of the kids is the CEO of the business. The daughter and the son-in-law get into a nasty divorce. Then the question is, what happens to the CEO of the business, who's doing a pretty good job, but who now there's a lot of tension with one of the children and with the whole family. I mean, that was a really interesting situation. And by the way the family resolved it, which I'll be honest, makes sense to me, but it's not the classic answer, is they basically told the former son-in-law that he needed to go find a job someplace else, that they just didn't, it didn't feel good to them for him to be running the family business, even if he was doing a good job. There's just too much tension, too many other issues, you know, and that's just an example of what can happen in a family business.
Jeff, hold on.
I'm interested in Jeff's comment about the move toward the 1 year tenure as a board member. It reminds me a little bit of Congress, where by the time you're in Congress, it's time to run for re-election. So, you know, does the 1 year term dampen people's, you know, willingness to really speak out, or what do you find in practice?
No, I don't think people view it unlike Congress, where I'm convinced all of my local Congress people think their job is to get reelected, not to do anything. I don't know, none of the board members that I know we don't think about, you know, it's there. It's really an avenue for the shareholders to be able to speak up on a frequent basis and say, you are not serving our interests well, and we don't want you there. And I suppose it's good to have that in the back of our minds as well. I'm just maybe fortunate enough not to be on boards where we consider it to be, you know, it's not our income. It's our fund. So we'd hate to leave. But no, I don't think that dampens it. And you know, there's certainly reasons why it's becoming more prevalent on the public side.
Yeah, that's an interesting comment. There may be somebody here who wants to contradict me, but in the public world, we've gone from, what do you call it, groups of directors.
Staggered boards.
Staggered boards. Yeah. Basically, the culture now is 1 year elections. And more companies are being required, really, to go to 1 year election. And the answer is, if a director is doing a good job, then re-elect him or her. And if they're not doing a good job, then don't re-elect them. But, you know, in many ways, staggered boards in public companies basically put a lot more control into management than the public world now feels is appropriate.
I'd make a quick observation that the comment we were just making about how do you want to pick a board member, what kind of experience do you want? Having terms allows you to deal with the misfits in a very nice, polite way. I hired this guy with public company experience. He really doesn't get the dynamics of a family environment. Maybe he or she should go do something else. Back of the room.
I think many of us are on not-for-profit boards in which we volunteer our services, but as I'm listening today, trying to distinguish between what you're suggesting as a board for a small business or a medium-sized business, we're really looking for someone who could be more of a consultant, that we are going to be paying a fee for their services and looking for them to actually bring real business experience, business knowledge. And as you talked about, John, needing to have a minority or a woman voice or a millennial voice at the table, what is the process that you go through in trying to identify where do I find these qualified individuals that may not be in our country club circle?
I mean, that's a challenge today, and I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, but if I understood the first part of what you said, I do want to agree with you. I've been trying to talk about what it's like and why business family business can benefit from a legal director. There are all sorts of, you know, advisory directors, consultants. That's a different kettle of fish as far as I'm concerned. So, to me, as you observed, you know, that, you know, some people are calling directors really advisors or consultants. I agree with that. You know, that's not really a director. And then, you know, you're raising the challenging question of, you know, how do we make sure that, you know, new voices have an opportunity to be heard and participate, and that's one of the real challenges of our society and of the business world. You got to work at it.
There's one over here, Laura.
Hi, thanks for speaking today. The question I had, you were discussing about the effectiveness of being an independent director, and we have some issues of that at work where maybe an independent director asks for certain information, but the management team thinks, well, the CEO is the owner. You know, if the CEO is not asking for it, I don't need to provide it. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe, you know, when you're becoming an independent director, asking for some respect or authority, that if, you know, I ask for something that, you know, I get it. Or what are your thoughts on that issue?
Well, depending on the situation, there's sort of a fine line of how independent directors interact with the business. So there are usually certain relationships set up. So there may be a relationship with the CFO, with an audit committee, but the primary route is normally through the is through the CEO. Certainly at a board meeting, all bets are off for anybody who's attending. But that's part of usually part of the formal or informal structure is independent directors shouldn't be. There's a fine line between snooping around and wanting to make sure they have the information they need to fulfill their fiduciary responsibilities.
So you need to convince the CEO that this is information that's important.
Yes, which if you're an independent director, hopefully wouldn't be too hard. But
okay, thank you.
Actually, if I could say, I sort of have a different attitude. Where I'm involved, I try to get to know at least the second or third layer of management, and I try to get to know the shareholders. It is not easy. You know, if you have, let's be realistic, if you have 20 shareholders, I'll actually spend time trying to get to know all the shareholders. I want to know what's on their mind. And which, at a board meeting, it gets a little bit dicey, it gets a little bit political, but I like to develop relationships with other people in management just to make sure that I'm getting, you know, the whole story.
Yeah, John, and I didn't mean to imply that's not important. The most important thing you can do as a director is really understand the bench of people that are there, but there's a difference between that and sort of trying to ferret out information that the CEO doesn't want you to have.
Right.
Which probably is indicative of another problem.
Yeah.
When is it in a business's lifespan that it becomes appropriate to even initiate a board, to start having a board, and how do you go about convincing a very successful founder or CEO that it is time?
Are you related to this founder CEO? Anybody want to tackle that?
You know, I just think it's appropriate whenever, I think it is appropriate in general whenever you have a business, because nobody, as the CEO, it's a big job, even if it's a startup company, but it's a big job. And if you're taking on a successor CEO, anytime you're in a leadership position, having a board of smart people who have experience in business and know how business works as a resource to you in stewarding the company, it's always appropriate. But it's only appropriate, and unfortunately you can't make it appropriate for someone else. Right. If the CEO or president of the company doesn't feel a need, he or she won't put the right people on it, listen to what they say, and it'll be a waste of time for all involved. So it has to be, I think it's a decision that has to be owned by the person who's leading the company.
Right.
When you all are being interviewed, do you all consider the liability that you would take on becoming a board member? And is it really different? Is the liability different for a private company than is a public company?
I only thought about liability when I was on the board of a publicly traded oil and gas limited partnership. And that I thought a lot about liability. I haven't thought about it.
I think it's one of the reasons that many private companies create the advisory director role, because there is no legal fiduciary responsibility there. And it's both good for the advisors, and it's the reason that someone who may be a high net worth individual that you're going to pay $25,000 a year will take that on. They wouldn't take it on for the risk necessarily. So that's one of the reasons that I think a lot of private family businesses go to the advisory director model instead of the governance director model.
If there is a complex family structure, which is sort of a euphemism for the likelihood that there are crazy, angry people out there in the shareholder group, then yeah, being able to check the box on some level of D&O insurance or some undertaking of the companies, I think you'd find people who are unwilling to join a board in that situation without that.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank our panelists for doing a great job. Please join me in thanking John, Carol, and Jessica.
Good show.
With that, for our final panel, I'm going to turn it over to Tom Hillman. Tom, take it away.
Thank you, and good morning or late morning. Delighted to have this broad perspective with our panel, all third-generation businesses, and they'll have hopefully some really courageous conversations with us. And what I'd like to do is have them all make introductions, and I'll say a few words, And then we're going to talk about a few different topics. The issue of the business of the family and the family business, and those perspectives as shareholders and private individuals working in the business. And I thought it was fabulous with Marcel, the way it was, what's that perspective of management toward that family? And then with Mike DeCola, that perspective of what are some best practices in governance as it relates to helping families? And this is a perspective now, not just of the business, but really from the family. And so with that, what I'll do is we'll go down a little bit, and I'll start with Tom Stern. And Tom has a unique situation because he is at the helm of the real estate holdings company, and he's been there 52 years, and he's still active in the business, and he married into the family. And Solon Gershman was his father-in-law, and in 1993, Tom became president. And at some point, you can see with the gray hairs, he's going to have to be thinking soon about succession planning. But Tom, why don't you give us a little perspective of marrying into the family and your perspective of family business?
Well, I guess I would start by saying that those of us who have what I would call relative abilities need to be able to show the people that we work with and then subsequently supervise that we're there by merit as opposed to by blood. And so my career, starting in the mid-'60s, was in sales and subsequently got involved in shopping center development and later in investing in various income properties and then also syndicating them. So by the time that I became president 25 years ago, I felt like I had shown the people that I work with and who work for me that I was the right person for the job. And we had a really good run. As it happens, my successor is in place, and that was the result of an advisory board that we put together shortly after Solon passed away, because I felt it was important to get some input from outside experienced business people as opposed to my wife's siblings who were not involved actively in the business. And so my successor has actually been in place for 5 years and allows me to play more golf, and that's a good thing.
Great. Next we have Melissa Marquardt from Spartan Metal Products. Melissa is the third generation, and she's working in the business, and she's actually had exposure to things that haven't worked out as well with her parents and the second generation of the business, and has applied herself very differently to make sure that there's real alignment of interests. So, Melissa, why don't you share a little bit about your background and perspective on family business?
Sure. I joined the business almost about 7 years ago. I'm in human resources, and we have a family employment policy that you have to work so many years outside of the business before applying for a position internally, which I met that fulfillment. But I was the first family member to join the family business in a long time, and when I joined, the only other family member working there was my father, who was our CEO at the time. So to be honest, I think they really just didn't know what to do with me when I joined. I think there was a little bit of, well, gosh, what is she going to do? And I had a job description, and I applied, and I went through all the proper protocols, but I think it was a difficult and interesting transition, and it was a little rocky at the start. I think there was a lot of concern, given what had happened with the generation previously. When I came in, we were in the process of doing a buyout at the second level generation, so people knew that from the family perspective, there was a lot of angst and friction happening at that time. And I think there was concern, was that going to trickle down to the third generation? And we've done a lot of work in order to keep that from happening, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later. One of the things I think that really helped me when I joined the family business, as well as later on, was really understanding what hat I wore when I wore it and why I was wearing it. So I think it's very easy when you have all these things coming at you from the family and the business and the employee side to get all of those mixed and confused with each other. But I think as I've grown in the business, what's helped me understand things is what's my role here? Am I an owner? Am I a shareholder? Am I being a sister or a daughter? Am I an employee? Am I a member of management? And really, how is that working and collaborating with each other?
Great. Pat Tracy, an amazing family story. His dad started the company in 1960, and Pat has 11 siblings, so he's one of 12. He was the first one of his generation, the second generation, to go into the family business. At the time, they had 30 employees, and the revenue was $5 million. Today, Pat's retired now as the chairman, but he was the first one from his generation, and he had 11 members from his generation in the business, 9 siblings and 2 brother-in-laws in the business. Today, the company has revenue in excess of $7 billion with over 5,600 employees, and it's still led by a family member. Pat, if you could share with us a little bit about your family perspective on the business.
I think you did a good job. I think well done here. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you for having me. And good morning. Really happy to be here. I've been I like to think of myself as a student of family business for all my life. I've been in family business all my life and found it very, very important just from an interest, but also from survival, as with a lot of family members in the business. And like many of you, been in the same audience at other events and so forth, and which we began at a very early time in our progression as a family business to learn. And we tried to learn from others' mistakes. As Tom said, we have a lot of family in the business, and there's a lot of family overall. As one of 12, 11 of the 12 were in the business, plus the 2 spouses. That's only in the second generation. So I have 5 sisters, all who worked in good positions in the business until marriage and motherhood called. And now they're involved in other leadership positions, though outside of the business, either in our family council or on our foundation. In the third generation, there are actually 47 at this point in time. So see the numbers get even a little bigger. Of the third generation, we have 14 in the business today, and expect more to come in eventually. We do have a fourth generation, which is made up of about, I think, 12 at this point in time. But the oldest is only 6, so they've neither provided an application for work or asked for a handout yet. So, we'll hear from them, I'm sure, before too long. But it's been an interesting ride for all of us. We've enjoyed a lot of growth during that time frame. Very fortunate that I can speak very highly of my 11 siblings and 2 brother-in-laws who were in the business, all very capable, competent people that have made big contributions to the business along the way. Most of them have also been in the business their entire life. We've had a few retire here in the last few years, but everybody's been there 20, 30, 40 years and so forth. And all have, as it turns out, different opinions of how we should do this, that, or the other. So we've spent a lifetime disagreeing, yet trying to do it in a manner that was not disagreeable. And we've had to do a lot of things to arrange for that so we could reach decisions, resolve conflict, keep communication channels open, and really move the business forward, and most importantly, to move the family forward at the same time. And I think we'll talk about a lot of those things during our time here together, Tom.
Yeah. And I think we learned earlier, and we all know that not every family is the same and not every family business is the same, and therefore there isn't necessarily a silver bullet that says this is how the best practice is for governance, because you have all different circumstances. That being said, Melissa, I'll start with you. You have 2 siblings, and your dad had 2 siblings, so you're each of 3. What's different for you with your generation, how you've handled things based on things that you've learned and seen with your dad's generation in the business?
For us, I think one of the biggest differences is engagement, collaboration, and transparency. In my father's generation, I think what you had was you had a single sibling working in the business, and then you had the other 2 siblings that did not work in the business. And there was sort of that clear line of definition between business and family. And there was the once-a-year shareholder meeting that people begrudgingly came to, and that was sort of that. I think that lack of engagement and collaboration amongst that sibling group created a situation where you had 3 people who really didn't necessarily know how to own a business together, which I think led to a lot of friction. And then that friction led to an amicable buyout of that generation. When I came into the business, which was during that time frame, and after that had kind of ended, there was a lot of conversation around how do we prevent that happening with the 3rd generation. So typically when you think of a 3rd generation, you think of a cousins group. Our 3rd generation is actually a sibling group, myself and my sister and my brother. And we sort of have that same setup where one of the siblings works in the business, which is myself, and my sister and brother do not work in the business. But there was a lot of conversation of how do we collaborate together so that way we can be responsible owners together in the future, as well as how do we create that engagement and transparency. Earlier we heard a lot about identifying with the business, having pride in the business, having people want to participate in the business, and we really looked for ways to create avenues and tools for my siblings to be able to do that, even though they weren't considered, quote, employees or active in the business in that way. We've done a lot of that, I would say, through governance, through our family council, which I know you mentioned as well. We have 2 foundations also, which family members participate in. My mother serves on our board of directors. She is the liaison between our family council and our board of directors as well. My brother is our family council chair. My sister has led different task force teams, which serves well for her since she's also in the automotive industry herself in her own career. And so I think by providing a lot of engagement and collaboration and pride and identification with the business, we're setting ourselves up to be owners together in a way where people are aware of the business, understand it, know who the advisors are, work with the board of directors. There was comments earlier about getting to know the shareholders. We've done a lot of that with our board of directors where they get to know us as individuals and what our expectations are. And I think having that open communication, having that collaboration, and having that pride in the business is sort of creating that team approach, I think, that we are using in our generation that wasn't really prevalent or there in the generation before ours.
Thank you. Tom, just curious if you could share some challenges you've had coming into the business and as a family business over the years.
Probably getting up in the morning of a board meeting and looking forward to that. No, I think we actually have 2 operating businesses, a mortgage company and our commercial real estate company, and then separately a number of LLCs that own individual parcels of real estate. So the biggest challenge is communicating to my wife's siblings information that allows us to make appropriate decisions. And particularly with regard to the individual parcels of real estate, which can be very capital intensive, it can impact distributions. And that's always something that everybody's interested in, but they have to understand that there are capital needs within the companies that need to be made as well.
And then how are decisions made? If you have a board of directors, do you have the family members that aren't in the business full time assisting in those decisions? How are decisions made in your?
There's a 3-member board of directors. My wife ceded her seat on the board to our oldest son, as well as my wife's siblings, and they make decisions on the basis of majority rule.
Okay. So there's no independent directors at this stage with the
There are not.
business?
And in fact, when Solon was alive, there was a board of directors in name only. There was no real, his attorney and his accountant were his board.
So Pat, you came into the family as the first of the second generation, and arguably your dad hadn't set into place the policy and the governance that you have today. And you really led and pioneered that effort for the family. How did you get started, and what were some of the resources of really shaping best practices when it was really uncharted territory for you and your family in terms of what had been previously set up?
Well, it was really learning on the job. I mean, Dad didn't know how many siblings were going to, or the children were going to come into the company, nor did I when I stepped in, and we kind of had a little bit of progress or process where they step in after college and then they go back for an advanced degree, and then we didn't know whether they'd come back. But after a while, they started collecting in, and I knew every year there was another one coming in because there were 12. They started showing up, and it became a process where we realized in looking at some circumstances, it was going to be a real challenge determining how to establish compensation, how to really assign responsibilities, how to basically resolve disagreement between siblings and so forth, and move things forward. My father wasn't one to, he was kind of an individual single decision maker. Give me a problem, give me an issue, I'll take care of it, but he didn't think about the thought planning process. So we had to go through that, and one of the first things that I observed as I was trying to manage my own siblings and their respective jobs and compensation and so forth is that in our family, I'm sure we're unique, but without exception, every one of the spouses of my siblings thought their spouse was the most underappreciated, hardest working, underpaid, person that really could take my job in a second. And maybe that's a little direct, but and yet I had to establish compensation that was have some appropriate basis to it. Doing it by birth order really wasn't going to work. Doing it by the most recent one in the business or the one that's longest tenure wasn't going to work. And so we had to really try to find a way to reach agreement that basically that we would take the last name away for all people when it came to compensation in the company, unless there were really no family members for compensation, for responsibilities, for promotions, et cetera. And yet, to be able to really have the authority to do that, we needed some forum to reach that agreement. And so that began with forming a family council, and which was one of the best things we ever did. We did it over 20 years ago. And when we established that family council, we were able to formally communicate together as a family on some of these issues and how we had to make decisions on such things as compensation, responsibilities, et cetera, even stock ownership eventually, and how we could do it together without everyone agreeing, but with arriving at some consensus of which everyone would support.
So along those lines of having so many members in the business and everyone feeling they're undercompensated and more capable, and how do you prepare the next generation? What kind of, to ensure the continuity of the company, and how are you selecting who the next leaders of the business? How is that done?
Well, we've taken a lot of the things we've learned in the second generation, and we're applying them to the third generation. So there's still no last name. Promotions are provided on merit. Compensation is according to the market, and a path for our family members in the business is not unlike the way we develop a path for non-family members. And so a lot of that's the same. Fortunately, a lot of our third generation members have a lot of pride of ownership of just being a part of the family, part of the company. And so they've naturally been attracted to the business. And very early on, we had to establish some some processes upon which family members would be eligible to join the organization. We have a 3-year rule, I think, as you do as well. And we tried to do that early on. One of the lessons I learned, which is a very, very important lesson, and we still failed occasionally with, is that when you want to establish family policies, such as on when family members can come into business, it's best if you do it well in advance of before the family members have names. So if it's Mary's son, Bill, or whoever it might be, and he's the one that wants to come in the company and you haven't yet set this policy, and then you want to set a policy that's going to prevent him from coming in maybe for 3 years, it can be very contentious. People become emotional about those things. Without names, when the kids are small, for example, or, for example, on spouse employment, when there are no spouses in the business or nobody anticipating it, then people can approach it unemotionally. They can approach it from just an intellectual standpoint and achieve agreement, which then people look forward and see this is how it works. If they want to join the company, these are the circumstances.
Melissa, when you grew up and then went into the family business, did you feel pressure of expectations that were different for you as a family member or of yourself or from the legacy in being in the third generation, being active in the business?
You know, what was interesting for me when I joined the family business was I think there was a lot of expectations from employees that there was sort of this understanding, oh, well, this is a family member, so therefore she must know everything there is to know about the business. And I think there was sort of this underlying expectation that whether it was financials, manufacturing processes, our customer base, our product lines, all of those things I would sort of have known through osmosis of, well, the assumption of this must have been dinner table talk, and I'm sure she absorbed that for the last 20-something years, and therefore she must know all of this information when she's coming in. And my experience was very different growing up. I think that my father had that experience growing up. He was 8 years old when the business was started. And so he sort of grew up with that sort of, not pressure, but expectation that he would go into the business. And I think my father didn't want that for us. So he separated business and family quite significantly. And we knew very little about Spartan growing up. We knew we had a family business. We knew that it was an hour or something away that my dad drove every day, but that's really all we really knew or engaged with the business other than the family picnic once a year. And so I didn't have that experience where I knew very little of the business when I came in, but the expectation was that I would know a great deal. I had a lot of learning to do, and I think since then we've done a lot around family member education. So we have educated family members who don't work in the business about the markets we serve and our products and our customer bases, because you know, if you are going to have all of your eggs in one basket and the majority of your wealth is going to be associated with this business, it's important that you understand the workings of the business, the industry you're in, the market, the possible disruptors. And so we've done a lot of that because I had the experience where I didn't really know much about that when I came in, and I think that was a little bit of a disappointment to some of our employees. I didn't have any pressure from my family, but I feel like I had more pressure actually from our employees and from management. But on the flip side, now that we've done a lot of that education, I think it creates a lot of confidence in our employees and our management and our board to see that engagement from the family members, to see people who don't work in the business speak somewhat knowledgeably about it or ask questions or inquire or build relationships with management and board members. And I think that that's really served us well, having that more open and transparent conversation and having individuals more knowledgeable about the business who don't work in it.
Thank you. Tom, tell us what you do for communication and to obtain strategic alignment of interests with your business.
Well, all of the directors receive monthly statements on the businesses as well as the properties. And then we meet quarterly to discuss what needs to be done going forward, to update everybody on items of interest. We have tried to institute a 5-year capital plan that we continue to roll over so they understand what the capital needs of the businesses are. And so I think the communication has been very helpful in that regard. As I said, we did succession planning in our real estate company, and that's worked very well. On the mortgage company side, we have a non-family member CEO who's been in place for 55 years. 7 years ago, he went along with the succession plan and identified 2 people as his potential successor. He's still there, and the successors are getting ready to retire. So we're going to have an interesting search when that comes to pass.
Pat, for family members that are not in the business, how do you keep them active, engaged? Do you see them where they should assume a responsibility as a stakeholder?
Very much so. And actually, I'd probably echo a lot of what Melissa shared about other leadership opportunities in the family. You know, when you're the CEO or have a officer position in a family business, even within your family, kind of that spotlight's on you, and, you know, Pat did this or John did that or whatever it happens to be, which is, I mean, for that person, that's everybody likes a little recognition. But for those others that are not in the spotlight, you know, there's certainly an opportunity for them not to feel so connected. And our family council opportunities, where most of our family members have served in the council, we established one of the first things the family council did after a couple other policies was to establish a family foundation, Tracy Family Foundation. It's been around for about 20 years now. And it has a lot of family members that have leadership positions on it. My one sister, who was a great sales rep for us, she's been the president of the organization for I think the last 15 years. And people have moved through there. We have terms, and they're on and off and so forth. We don't try not to work anybody too hard. But at our annual family meeting, they have prominent roles in terms of talking to the family about things that they're doing in the foundation, on the council, throughout the business. And so it's really spread around. And so that spotlight is shown in a number of places. And it really engages not, again, just, say, siblings, but also spouses. And then the next generation as well. It's given us the opportunity to allow some of these third-generation members an opportunity to have some leadership positions and display leadership skills and to learn and really develop a stickiness or connection to the company. And through all that, I think we all become better shareholders too, because people are exposed to this information, they care about it, they learn it, and they talk it. And it's been a wonderful process for us. I don't know what we would have done without it.
Great. I'm going to go to some more rapid questions with shorter answers, cover more topics. But Tom, what's the best advice you've been given?
My dad had a sign over the bar in our rec room at home, which was, make sure your brain is engaged before putting your mouth in gear. So, you know, think about what you're going to say before you say it.
Pat, how about you? Any credo or something that?
Well, in the distribution business, it was always buy low and sell high. But in the family business thing, something that's always stuck with me, I both heard it and then witnessed it many times since. And it said that, you know, family business, when it's good, there's nothing better. There's really nothing better. When it's bad, there's nothing worse. And I've seen the worst side from colleagues and other businesses. We're fortunate that of our 5,000 customers, most of those are family businesses, and our almost 1,000 manufacturers and broker partners and businesses. You get to witness a lot of things, and that saying really stands to be true.
Melissa.
This is a quote that we have from my grandfather, and we have it all over our locations. And it's if you're talking, you're not listening, and if you're not listening, you're not learning. And that, I think, goes for whether it's in our family council meetings, at our shareholders meetings, or just in management in general. I think there's a lot to be said for listening, and it's certainly a skill I continue to try to work on. Sometimes I think it was written for me because I tend to talk a lot. But I would say that. And one of the other things I think that has been very helpful for me is be authentic. I think that you come in and you're a family member and there's stigma and people watch you, but I think if you're authentic and true to yourself and you have passion, people really respond to that, and they have a very positive response to it.
So not all advice is great advice. What's the worst advice you've been given?
Go into the family business.
You want to elaborate on that, Tom?
It's been a wonderful opportunity for me and is taking great care of our family. But it's certainly not without its bumps in the road and pitfalls. And I think that's the hardest part of a family business that you probably don't have in a public company, because you don't have the relationship. You're not trying to make sure you have Thanksgiving dinner together, as well as running a company. So that's a challenge.
Pat, how are your Thanksgiving dinners?
Well, it's really a convention. The family's about 100 at this time, and so that means we've got 100 different opinions in the room.
What's the worst advice you've been given?
You know, I think the worst advice is any time that people set limits on individuals or on the company and what could be accomplished. And also the number of family members in the business. We've, I think, been warned repeated times by, well, how can you do that, and why would you want that many family members? Why would you recruit more family members into the business in the third generation? And we found it to be a rich resource, especially in the early years when we couldn't really attract talent, if you will, into this small little business and so forth. The talent had to come from within the family. And now the third generation is still delivering talent to the business. And so I'm glad we didn't heed those words.
Worst advice. I think, you know, when I first came in, sometimes there was this sense of, you know, be like everyone else, and in some cases that can be good, but in other cases I think there was the sense of, you know, kind of hiding who you were, or, you know, not really showing that pride in your family business. And I truly think that your employees and your management and people in the business want to see family members who care and who are passionate. And I think trying to shy away from that is a disservice.
Talk about some mistakes that you've made, that you look back and say, I may have failed in this area, but I failed fast, I failed forward. But when you look back in your career and the things that you've done, what are some of the biggest mistakes?
You talking to me?
Talking to everyone.
I can't think of any. I'm not sure that there have been a lot that are impactful on our company or companies, but certainly there are probably some personnel decisions. I guess my biggest disappointment is that we have 3 sons. They all came into the business and they all spent some time there and then left. Fortunately, very successful transitions for them. That's worked out great, but I would have enjoyed having the opportunity to spend more time with them in a working situation.
Thank you. Melissa?
Biggest mistake, I think for us, and this is kind of for the third generation, I think there's, we're kind of in a transition point in our business, and we're moving into an industry that we've never been in before, in structural components for the automotive, and it's a huge change for us, and we're building a new facility, and me and my siblings are, you know, we've got millennials in that group, and we've heard a little bit about millennials today, but there's a sense of wanting to drive and push, and, you know, then there's the other generation that wants to slow down and do things more thoroughly, and I think sometimes that's created some friction between G3 and G2, and I think one of the things that we're trying to do, or at least I'm trying to do, is understanding things from other people's perspective, putting yourself in other people's shoes and listening before talking. And sometimes I haven't done such a good job of that, and I've pushed too hard, and I've talked before thinking. And I think those would be some of the mistakes I've made.
I have a rather large cadre. How much time do we have?
2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes, and keep it to the family business topic, right? I still kick myself about this today. I shared with you there was a lesson I learned early on in family council is to try to get to processes relative to the family side of things in the business before they have first names and are connected to families. And I failed on that a couple times in the next 15 years after that. And it was because I got my nose too deep in our business and wasn't looking enough at the family side. And I've always been a planner and been proud of that. But we had a couple issues that came up that had names with them. And it reinforced again why you should do that without the names. If at all possible, you have to be ahead of it. Because our family got through both of these, but they were very difficult. And we've had a strong process set up, and we have folks that communicate openly and love each other. But it just reminded me again of how difficult it is to really approach these things in an unemotional manner. You can't be done. And when emotions take over, that makes things much more difficult.
Do you all think that you could have a continuity and a sustainable, long-term, multi-generational family business without having the governance of independent directors over multiple generations? Or do you feel that you have to have that?
I'll speak up. We've had outside directors in our business for about 16 years right now. It's one of the best things we ever did. We had really only become a board about 10 years before that. We had a board, as Tom said, but it was my father running the meetings, and they took 30 minutes or so, and we were done. But when we really began acting as a board, but again, family members, it was pretty easy to get locked up. Even as CEO, and yet with a minority position in ownership of the company, we were all really partners in there together. And emotions rise, there are different opinions, and you can get just locked up on things. And so we made decisions. It was much better than not having a board at all. But when we brought outside directors in, it made us more professional, more collegial. It moved the conversations along. Whenever we got into this kind of, locked up, there was an independent director we could go out to and say, well, what's your opinion, Joe? Or what's your opinion, Liz? And it just kind of moved things along. And so it elevated all of our performance to a much higher level. And one other quick thing that happened was that we brought in, I'm thinking back to the last panel, we brought in people who could bring extra things in. And one of the folks that came in was, she was from HR, and we made her chairman of our compensation committee. And when that occurred, my next salary review, I got a six-figure salary increase, which wouldn't have been possible. And so it shows you how the family stuff works sometimes. But and it worked, though, and even though some of the partners in the boardroom were pushing back on that, again, she shared their information. They had respect for her, and the rest of the family, was happy about it because of that, and it just makes things move a lot better.
We also have an external board, started in the mid-90s. It started as an advisory board. Now it is a board of directors with fiduciary responsibility. We also have a compensation committee on our board. We have a human capital committee as well. And I think that they have just been instrumental. I think they've been very helpful in helping us set strategy with elevating performance of managements. We kind of see our role as family as we set the vision, the mission, and the values of our business. We then send those vision, mission, and values to our board. Our board is then responsible for sharing those with management, and management is responsible for making sure that happens in the day-to-day operations and the policies that are set in our business. And I think that flow has worked really well for us, and I think it's provided that communication, that ownership structure, those roles of leadership that family members can take on the council level so they feel like they're helping with the strategy of the business in many ways. And I think our board has just been absolutely instrumental. I can't imagine running our business without it.
We do not have any outside directors on our board. After Solon passed away, after consulting with Dr. Lefton, we put together an advisory board. And it was, for me as the one family member who was in the business, really helpful. And as we went through the processes and tried to get through issues like compensation and governance, the advisory board got disbanded. And so that was troubling for me. And I think some of the issues that we've gone through subsequently probably would have been smoother had we had the outside consultants. But at this point, it's a secular board.
So let's talk a little bit about the future. I mean, you have a family business. Everyone here is third generation. We learned earlier of the statistics, so you're in single digits. Is that something that you all plan and hope that with the succession that you're building things that will stay in a family and be generations from now? And what does that look like? Or not?
Well, I think it's certainly the hope that it would continue in the family. I think it's likely that it will be run by non-family members, although one of my nephews has joined our real estate company, and it's hopeful that he'll gravitate in management and grow. So it's certainly possible that at some point in the future that he could be involved in management. But I don't see any reason that the businesses won't be family-owned.
And Pat, when you look at your family, and if you said 50 years from now, is there a possibility you'll have an outside family member running the company, or do you feel that you're doing the things to mentor and develop the leadership for the future?
Well, we have very public intentions within the family and outside that we plan to stay private, independent for the very long foreseeable future, certainly through into the third generation and into the fourth. We do a lot of hard work on succession planning in the organization, again without last names, and that succession process has allowed us to have really the fourth CEO succession occurred just recently. I was the second, succeeded my father, had one brother succeeded me about 10 years ago, and then another one has succeeded him now, and he's our executive chairman. But we'll need to be dipping into the third generation, not too distant future, probably in the next 15 to 20 years. However, in approaching that, we've already concluded that as a family business, we don't have to have a family member as the CEO. Would it be nice to have one? Well, it's served us well so far, but it's not required. We'll still be a family business, and we'll still be managing the family in the business. And so while there may be someplace in that 47 member third generation, which could be 94 with spouses, could be someone in there that might have the ability to run a $7+ billion business, which might be much larger 15 years from now, but it doesn't have to be. In the meantime, we're going to continue to do succession planning and develop all of our people so that we have other options within the business of individuals that may not be family, but are very capable of running the business.
And Melissa, in your situation, your business is very technical, and with engineering, you're not an engineer. You've communicated previously that you would never expect or to be the CEO of the company. Your dad's currently the CEO of the business, and he's here in this room, Don Jubal. And so what does that succession look like, and who makes that decision? Is there a board? Is there something in place to organized now for the future of the leadership change and transition?
So we actually made this transition at the end of last year. So my father moved to chairman of the board, and we have the first non-family member CEO. And that was a transition that we had been preparing for quite some time. He was an internal candidate that we had been grooming, and that was sort of the expectation. And it's been a transition, but what's been really great to see is that the family's been extremely supportive of that transition. Management's been supportive, and the board was instrumental in that transition as well. What is challenging is, he was kind of set. He was an internal candidate. He's been with us a long time, but he set a retirement date, and now he has been tasked by our board of directors to find his successor. So we're kind of in the midst of that, and we've done some hiring and expanded our executive team in order to hopefully have someone internally, not necessarily that it will be, the understanding that that next person will probably also not be a family member as well, and the family's aware of that and is supportive of that. And I think that the board has been very helpful in that, whether we do an internal or external search. And for the first non-family member CEO, I think it's going to be the hardest. For the second one, it'll probably be a little bit easier. So he's sort of paving the way for all of us. But that's what that transition looks like, and the board plays a role in that. But the family had input as well. At our family council meetings, everyone was asked do we feel comfortable with this individual leading our organization? Do we feel comfortable that they'll represent our values in our organization? And we felt that they would, and I think it's going well.
So in a minute or two, we're going to open up to questions. And what I would just openly like to ask, what advice would you like to give this audience on any subject that you are here on perspective of family business that you would like to communicate? Pat, any advice you'd like to tell our audience?
Well, I think I'm very passionate about family business. I think we have a huge competitive advantage over our public brethren. I think we can move a lot faster, just quicker on our feet, making decisions, moving to new markets, taking advantage of new technologies. I think we also have the ability from a family standpoint of being able to communicate better. Our values that normally originate from the family itself are oftentimes projected into the business. Those values become a culture in the business, and strong cultures can recruit the best people. And so that's another advantage we have over public companies. And the other thing was mentioned in another panel, that I really think the fact that we can think long-term instead of short-term allows us to really compete more effectively. So I think there's great promise for family businesses going forward and for each of yours. However, there's also a big pitfall out there. The pitfall is that something public companies don't have to deal with is family in the business. And I've seen family in the business bring many family businesses down. And those issues need to be managed. People need to communicate on them and so forth. Otherwise, you lose it. And something we did that's been really good for us, it's brought calm in our family from almost the very beginning. We achieved this about 20 years ago. But we established kind of a pecking order, if you will, or a mantra for ourselves. And the thing that was most important to us was a happy, fulfilled, harmonious family. And the second thing was a happy, fulfilled, harmonious family in business together. And then after that, it was to have those things and have family members in the business. But said differently, that the family was more important than the business. We're confident that we don't have the business, we'll all be able to find our way, and that we don't want to show up at the Thanksgiving table that you ask about and be there without one or two or maybe a lot of family members because the family hold us apart.
I think for us, one of the things that we have a very, very similar approach, I think, in a lot of the ways that we approach things as well. But I think you cannot overestimate the importance of external resources and how those can serve your family business. We've done a lot of that from not only the operations and running our business and to make it more sophisticated, but we've done a lot of that on the governance side. A lot of the things that I described to you that we've been able to do, we haven't come up with these on our own. Those have been through a variety of different resources that have been helping us. And there's a lot of resources out there available to families of how do you start, how do you build a family council, how do you set your mission, vision, and values, what does governance look like, how can a family office help you, what does consulting groups do. philanthropy. How do you begin a foundation? What does it look like? How do you participate in it? There's a lot of things that we've done on the governance side in the last 5 years, and we've been able to do those things through bringing in external resources, going to conferences, joining organizations, coming to things like this, and I think that those have just been paramount. And the more family that you can get engaged in those things, I think the better, because it's one thing for me to listen and then go share, but it's another thing for people to go and participate and understand the roles that they can play across the family business, whether they're employed there or whether they're not.
I think, as Pat said, one thing a family business can do that public companies can't is act with decisiveness and in short order. But I'm very excited about the family business center that the Kochs are providing. I think that's going to be a resource for family businesses in the St. Louis metropolitan area and maybe all over Missouri and Illinois. Sort of a one-stop shop that can provide aid and counsel where issues come up in family businesses that might not in a public company. So I think that's going to be a great resource for all of us. So thank you, guys.
So I want to thank our panel because they've really shown vulnerability, that not all families are the same. They're real issues, and they've been very willing to share and have these courageous conversations. So before we do questions, let's just thank our panel. And with that, we'll open the floor for any questions. Spencer.
The question I have, would you each talk about this what I think is a challenging decision of running the business and keeping family members happy, and that is the payment of dividends. Maybe a situation where there was sort of a dispute on that and how it got resolved.
So the question is, what situations have arisen and how do you handle dividends for family members? And what resolutions have you been if a dispute has arisen as a result of what you've been doing on distribution policy?
Probably under-promise and over-deliver. I think, as I said, we communicate with our stakeholders on a regular basis so they know what the properties and what our companies are capable of doing. And as I said, we have a 5-year capital plan so they know what parts of revenues are going to be put in reserve to take care of those situations. So communication, let them know what's happening.
Well, we have those disputes on a quarterly basis, Spencer, just so you know. And you'd think doing something, again and again and again, we get pretty good at it. We get pretty good at the dispute part. But frankly, it's not that bad. But I found the dividends to, really be a challenging thing in family business. We went out, we're kind of analytical maniacs sometimes, so we went out and really tried to survey a lot of family businesses to find out how people do it, so that we could get a best practice and bring it in and apply it. And we didn't find that best practice. We didn't find really even a lot of consistency. So what we've tried to do is we try to set up some connection between business performance and ownership and share value that is understandable by the family and is a little predictable relative to the dividend. So if the business is doing well, it's a better dividend. It's not, and so forth. It also works as a communication tool. You can say anything you want to shareholders, but if the dividend goes down, then that's when they'll understand, well, the business isn't doing as well as it used to. So we try to do that. And also because I found dividend discussions can just monopolize time in a board meeting. When you need to talk about customers and so forth. And so we've tried to set it up so we start with a calculated number that is a process we agreed to, and then we let people argue if it should be something different than that, and then get to it as quickly as you can.
Ours is somewhat similar. We have a dividend policy that everyone agreed to, and that is reviewed regularly by our board and updated accordingly. It's based off of EBITDA and a variety of other things. We also bring in an external valuation company that does a valuation of our organization every year. and assigns us a multiple, so that way we understand the market value of our business and we understand the share value as well. And then we kind of work within that policy, and then we do a 5-year strategic plan, and the estimated dividends based off of our book of business are presented to the shareholders at our board retreat and in our shareholder meetings every year, so you can understand what your dividends are expected to be across the next 5 years. For our business, that's very doable because we normally know our book of business between 3 and 5 years out, so we can make those kind of clear estimations, which is helpful for planning for family members, so they have that understanding of what their dividend's going to be. But the valuation is done every single year, and the dividend policy is reviewed every year by the board.
Question.
The first two presenters touched on this, and from this question about dividends, I'm sure you have a good answer for this kind of attachment, and that is the arrangement that you've made with shareholders, minority shareholders, and liquidation that may be needed for these stakeholders. And are you comfortable with how you address that? The liquidity question.
I'll speak to it. You know, the family business is not for sissies, I have to say to people, and it's really a full contact sport most of the time. And,
12 other people.
Exactly, and well, it may not come to fisticuffs. There certainly are circumstances where you know, you have difficult challenges to overcome inside the business. I think it's critically important, and we as a family do, to allow the opportunity for people to excuse themselves from the scrum, if you will, to be able to exit the business from an ownership standpoint, or at least to have some liquidity that they can take advantage of, so that if they're not happy how things were, they can go and invest elsewhere. So we have a very, like anything else, we've got lots of processes. We've got a very specific formal process by which people have visibility to exactly how they can create some liquidity, in fact, complete liquidity if they so desire, to excuse themselves, at least from ownership of the business, but not have to excuse themselves from the family at the same time.
Ours is very similar. We have very clear buy-sell agreements that are outlined for everyone so that they understand if they were to exit the business, what would that look like, or exit the business partially because they want that additional liquidity. That is outlined for everyone, so people are aware of that process. And then our dividend policy also allows for some of that liquidity as well, so that way you can continue your ownership but also have some liquidity from the business also.
In our situation, the stock is still owned in the first generation. My mother-in-law is 93, and she still owns 100% of the businesses. The siblings own a significant part of the real estate, and so the dividends that they receive come from that.
Yes.
My question is for Pat Tracy. I'm very interested in the concept of using the Family Foundation to provide leadership platform for non-management family members. At what stage did that of your growth did that start, and then how did it evolve?
Well, it did evolve, and again, the foundation was very small to start with, and so just being on the board provided some opportunity for leadership and the voice they had in shaping this new entity that had been established, and shaping its future, and establishing the vision for it, its mission, and its areas of intent, and the way it would work, and its governance practices. So that was very good. Since that time, though, it's evolved into a much larger organization with a larger board, and also a number of operating committees. And each of those committees has a leadership, chairman, and also even down into the next generation, we'll have like the next gen committee, things like that, and opportunities for rotation through those committee chairmanship positions. And so it's worked very, very well, and our family members have really come to the water there really well and have made a big difference.
What is the mission of the foundation? And a lot of the companies that are here today are in initial stages of trying to figure out to form some of these governance issues. Would you do it when you reach a certain volume stage, or would you do it when you reached a certain number of family members involved?
Well, number one, you need to have a little resource to establish the foundation and to do some gifting, because if you're really not carrying out any work, then it really is kind of a moot point. But in terms of the mission, we work in the youth and family area, we work in education, and in a few other specific areas that are important to the family and to the business and to our communities. We've operated within the footprint of our employee footprint of the organization, so it covers a 10-county area and so forth. And basically, we try to make those communities, in whatever way we can, better for all of our employees and their families who live there. And it works hand in hand with the corporate charitable effort, and they coordinate very closely together. So I would start small.
One more question. Paul.
What mechanics do you use to get objectivity into family member compensation, working family member compensation?
Melissa, HR department.
Okay. At our executive level, our compensation is set by the compensation committee, which is our board. For the rest of our organization, we have a compensation specialist that does compensation reviews, salary planning process, which takes place annually every year in February. We do a market analysis. We purchase probably between 5 to 8 surveys every single year. We analyze that market data. We look at people internally, and then we normally try to run between 50th to 75th percentile in terms of our market pay. Our family members working in the business, which is just myself at this time, I am subject to the same process as every single other individual. So I have an opportunity for a merit adjustment based on my performance. I have an opportunity for a market adjustment based off of what is my position and what is it being paid in the market. And so I can have a market adjustment as well. And then my short-term incentive plan is the same structure as everyone else in the organization, which is a combination of cash flow, pre-tax profit, and what we call CONC, which is cost of nonconformance. So you can think of that as waste or scrap, and that is consolidated across all of our organizations. And I'm subject to that as part of my short-term incentive plan since I'm a corporate employee. So it's really no different than any other individual in the organization.
So I think, as our chairman, Spencer, wanted to end on time and be on time, I think mission accomplished. So thank everyone for everything you've done.